we're starting a little bit late, but let me just run through what we're going to do this morning. But before I do that, I just wanted to introduce two people here that are provided the workshop yesterday on the seabird bycatch discussion. So Ed Melvin, he's with the Washington Sea Grant, and Ron Surian, Oregon State University. If you could just stand up and wave your arms. And so if you had any question for either of those two gentlemen, you could catch them at the break and have a discussion with them. So for our agenda this morning, the first off, we're going to have a staff report from Steve Martell around the minimum size limit consideration. This came from the request from the commissioners to consider a size limit reduction from 32 to 30. And the commission wanted to understand what the impacts would be of making that kind of change. We've had some discussion on that, but the staff will report on some of the considerations and impacts that may have of making that kind of change. What we're going to do is separate the morning into two components. So that will be the first one, and we're going to then take public comment when Steve has finished his report. And then we'll take a break before going on to the second section on bycatch topics. And there's two particular components within that. There's a short report from the Commission on the Halibut Bycatch Working Group report and the way ahead. And then we will have a discussion around the meeting that we're going to have with the North Pacific Fishery Management Council. And then we're going to have a presentation. Maybe, Jim, I'd let you introduce that next piece. There's going to be the report from from Alaskan fishermen around the bycatch reductions and plans for how that could happen. We've allotted 30 minutes for that presentation, and then there would be an option for further public comments, and that would include both the bycatch topics and the regulatory proposals that Heather provided to us yesterday. So, Jim, did you have anything more that you wanted to say about the bycatch? No? Okay. So that's what the morning is going to be, and we'll start with hearing from Steve around the minimum size limit considerations.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Steve Martell, and I work for the Halibut Commission. I work on harvest policy advice and also lead the Management Strategy Evaluation Board. The commissioners at our interim meeting in December asked for an analysis on changing the size limit from 32 inches down to 30 inches. And in that short period of time, Ian and I and Bruce have sort of put together a little bit of work we've done analyzing the setline survey data to ask those questions, as well as looked at some model, an equilibrium model, to help sharpen our questions and how we move forward on this. But the presentation is a little bit dry, and I was asked if I could dress it up a little bit, so I'm going to get Chelsea to come help me. So this is relative to Commissioner Boyd's bow tie. This is a 30-inch bow tie, not a 32-inch bow tie. The problem, as we see it, is that the size at age in Pacific halibut continues to decline, and it's particularly exacerbated in the Gulf of Alaska. In our setline survey alone, a large fraction of the fish we catch in that survey, greater than 40% by weight and greater than 50% by numbers, are actually below the minimum size limit. And the way we calculate wastage in our halibut assessments each year is we actually take the ratio of the sublegal to legal fish that we catch in our survey, and we multiply that ratio by the commercial catch in those regions. Then we multiply that by a 16% discard mortality rate. And then there's another small component that's dealt with in terms of lost gear as well as regulatory discards in Area 2A. So if we're going to change the size limit, the key thing that we can measure is the catch of fish that are that are of legal size. We do this in our port sampling programs. And then the key thing we can't measure in the commercial fishery is what is the commercial fishery catching relative to what the setline survey is catching. So we make the assumption that the setline survey has the same selectivity curve below 32 inches in the commercial fishery. So the potential benefits of reducing the minimum size limit are somewhat obvious. Immediately you can think of reducing the minimum size limit, you're going to be actually keeping fish that you would otherwise throw away, so you'd reduce wastage. This trade-off in fish you would waste would directly translate into an increase in yield. You're also going to increase your efficiencies of your operation. You're just going to have a higher CPE, so spend less time and effort and fuel and bait trying to catch the same quota. And then the other indirect benefit is less bycatch on other non-target species because of the reduced effort. And I'm sure there's many other benefits that I haven't thought about more fully. The big problem is what are the potential risks of doing this? So one of the risks that we read about in our textbooks is there's foregone yield associated with growth overfishing, and I'll explain that a little later. There's also an increased risk of recruitment overfishing or fishing the spawning biomass to a lower level. There's a problem that's already inherent in our current assumptions in that cryptic mortality can occur because of our poor assumptions about the setline survey selectivity and the commercial fishery selectivity. So if there is a shift in the commercial selectivity, this would go undetected in the short term, and we wouldn't learn that this happened for at least a generation or so of fish. The other risk is that if selectivity does shift towards and starts targeting smaller fish, we could actually increase the wastage and not reduce it at all. And finally, I'll show you why this happens too. There's also an increased incentive to target smaller, more abundant halibut in the commercial fishery. I want to step back and remind everyone, though, that changing the minimum size limit is strictly a policy question. We can find out if we're measuring selectivity at sea and we have all of our other parameter estimates in order within our stock assessments, we can determine what the optimal harvest rates and allocation should be among the different fishing gears, regardless of whatever the size limit is in the fishery, or even if there's no size limit. But we do need to have data to answer these questions. So the important question this year for the Commission is, does it make sense to reduce the minimum size limit at a time when the trends in the coastwide abundance are in decline? The mean size at age continues to decline in some areas. The age at recruitment as a result of slower growth is also delayed. I think a male now is about 14 years on average before it recruits to the fishery, whereas in the 1970s that fish was 8 years old. And the greater proportions of sublegal fish are being captured in the directed fishery. This is really a difficult question to ask, and the answer really depends on what is the objective of reducing the minimum size limit. So my talk here today and the paper in the Blue Book really is to identify what we think this objective and the key questions associated with that objective are. I'm going to show you some analysis that Ian Stewart has done with the setline survey data and looking at what proportion of the data are sublegal over a range of size limits. Talk more in depth using an equilibrium model to talk about the benefits and risks of reducing the minimum size limit. Introduce a policy response matrix that we've sort of come up to help us think about what the data might look like and what the questions we could answer given that data would be. I really want to highlight the fourth bullet point here, the sensitivity of the assumptions on total mortality and how selectivity, discard mortality rates, bycatch and size at age, and natural mortality affect our assumptions about how to move forward on this question. And finally, I'll discuss this in more detail and try and answer these key questions for you. So let's start first with the objective. The objective of reducing the 32-inch minimum size limit to 30 inches is to reduce total mortality in the stock vis-a-vis reducing the amount of wastage in the directed fishery. This is the only thing that the Halibut Commission can really do to reduce total mortality rates in the stock. Some of the key questions that I've identified that we're trying to, that should be of concern is reducing the minimum size limit to 30 inches likely to reduce wastage? So you would think this is an obvious question to answer, but when you sit down and think about it, it's actually quite challenging to answer given the data we currently have. So what is measurable under our existing sampling programs, and how long would it take to measure a stock response to the changes in minimum size limit given these available data? And then lastly, this is perhaps the most important question that was, we affectionately refer to this as the Balsiger question. It was the question that Jim posed at the interim meeting. Is it actually conservative to reduce the minimum size limit to 30 inches, knowing that Ian's going to produce a decision table that's based on a 32-inch minimum size limit and the apportionment's based on a 32-inch size limit? So this is a very tricky and challenging question. Regarding the size composition in the setline survey, what we want to do is sort of examine the range within each of the stations we do inside each regulatory area. We want to examine the range of how much or what percent of the fish we catch are sublegal in each of these regulatory areas. And is a large range suggests that there's a possibility that you could avoid areas that have small fish and go to areas that have large fish. The other thing you can look at is the percent discarded over a range of minimum size limits. So let me go ahead and show you the first bullet point here. This figure is in your blue book on page 192. And what it is it represents the percent of sublegal fish in numbers taken in our setline surveys between 1997 and 2014, represented by the lines with the circles on them. The thin lines represent the inner and outer quartiles. So basically, 50% of the data lies in between those two lines, is this right? And then the other 50% of the data is outside those extremes. The point to address here, and I'll point your attention to areas 3A and 3B highlighted by the circles, is that the trends in the percent sublegal have been increasing steadily in area 3 since 2005, and we're upwards of greater than 50% and greater than 70% in sublegals in these two particular areas. The range is also narrower within these two areas, suggesting that the diversity of size distributions in these areas is quite restricted relative to some of the other areas. I lost my thing on here, Jay. I'm not going to touch it. Within each of the sub-areas, I'm going to show you two extremes here, area 2A and area 3B. Within each of these sub-areas, the other thing we can do is we can look at the proportion of the catch in numbers in the top panel or by weight on the bottom panel. And then we also have by sex, male and female. We can show what proportion of the catch, if we were to change the size limit from 30 inches to 32 inches down to 30 inches all the way down to 26 inches, we can show what proportion of the catch in the setline survey would be sublegal. So this, again, is the ratio that we would multiply the commercial catch data by to generate the wastage estimate that comes off the top in our annual survey. So 16% of multiplied by these ratios is essentially how much fish you could save. And if you look at area 3B, we see a significant increase in the percent by numbers, as much as 70%, and by numbers, and over nearly 47% by weight in area 3B. One of the things we were hoping to see when we plotted this out is that as soon as we lowered the size limit, this would sort of make a huge number of male halibut that were sublegal size available to the fishery. And it didn't pan out the way we anticipated. The ratios on those bars are pretty much constant over the range of size limits. So it's not suggesting that there's a whole pool of large or small male fish that would now be available for harvest. Can you fix this, Jay? Thanks. Pardon me. Thanks, Steve. If it doesn't say Mac, I can't touch it. One of the things we can do with those graphs, I've just taken this table and translated those numbers, those percent survey catch by weight discarded versus the minimum size limit. So there's a table here. This is also available out of your blue book. So you can read off here. I'll give you a minute to go to your favorite area. For example, in Area 2, there's not a whole lot to be gained by reducing the size limit from 32 inches to 30 inches. In Area 2A, for example, 14.2% of the fish we catch in that region is sublegal. This would be reduced to about 6%. The areas where it really makes a huge, significant impact is in Areas 3A and 3B, and then very little change happens out in 4B and 4CB and E, as there's a fairly constant size distribution out in those areas. So I'm going to switch from database thing to more modeling-based approaches for the remainder of this talk. The benefits and risks of reducing the minimum size limit, and talk specifically about this policy response matrix. Again, this is the list of potential benefits we would have in reducing the minimum size limit. So if we dig into each one of these things a little bit deeper, we can try and understand how reducing the minimum size limit could have potential effects. We've been through the Management Strategy Evaluation Advisory Board, the MSAB. We've actually asked lots of questions regarding our harvest policy, and specifically try to understand how size limits, changing the minimum size limit, would impact our harvest policy. And each of us, I think, in that room of 20+ people, all agree with this first question: how do we begin to even understand how all of these moving parts would affect our harvest policy? And then specifically, every time we move something, we keep asking questions: how sensitive are our assumptions, or how sensitive are the reference points to each of these moving parts? So these are some of the key challenges we've been dealing with in the Management Strategy Advisory Board. And one of the ways we've tried to address this question is we sat down and we wrote a tool, and this tool is available on the website up shown here on the screen. Anyone can open this up, and you can start to play with size limits and compare, say, procedure A with procedure B and see what the impact is. So the results I'm going to show you from here on in actually come right out of this website interface. And I have to say, first and foremost, when I built this thing, it was more of a tool for me to help understand. And when we showed it at the MSAB meetings, a lot of the participants in that meeting went back to their hotel rooms that night and started playing with this, and they came back to the meeting next day, and they had their own recommendations about what was going to happen. So it was a really powerful tool and a learning lesson, both for me and them, on what you can do with such an interface. One of the outputs, one of the first major outputs we look at, and this is where our optimum fishing mortality rates are and our MSY-based reference points come from, is a model where you would explore on the x-axis how hard the directed fishery is going to fish. So this is fishing effort or fishing intensity or exploitation rate, if you like. And then what the corresponding yield would be on the y-axis. Now, this is an equilibrium model, and I'd like to take a second to sort of explain what that means. An equilibrium model, when you're developing harvest policy, you're taking a very long-term perspective. So the way, as Ian explained yesterday, the harvest policy was developed is they did some simulations in which they would run the model out over 100 years. And on average, for example, if they took a fishing mortality rate of 10% on this graph, they would achieve roughly 30 million pounds of yield. And then as you increase that fishing mortality to, say, 15% and ran the model again for another 100 years, you would ask what would the average catch be over that period of time, or using that exploitation rate, and it starts to increase. And at some point, you're going to get to a point where you're going to maximize the yield, and any fishing effort or level beyond that, on the right-hand side of the graph, results in diminishing returns. You're just spending more money to catch less fish. Okay. In the two procedures here, and I'll always show you two procedures. Procedure A, the salmon-colored or orange-colored fish, did I just say fish? Orange-colored line is the harvest policy results corresponding to a 32-inch minimum size limit, and the teal or blue-colored line is the harvest policy results using a 30-inch size limit. This model is actually built on the model results that come out of our 2014 stock assessment, in addition to the current size at age data used, the coastwide average current size at age data used in the stock assessment model. So it's a pretty accurate reflection of what the harvest policy would be under an MSY-based reference point. Shifting the minimum size limit from 32 inches down to 30 inches has two effects. One, you do see a slight increase in the overall maximum sustainable yield. That corresponds to the blue arrow there pointing to the y-axis relative to the salmon-colored arrow. And you can also achieve that greater yield using less fishing effort. So this is a good thing. And the reason why you see this increase is as you drop the 32-inch size limit to the 30-inch size limit, you actually reduce the wastage in the fishery by roughly 50%. So on the y-axis here we have now wastage in the fishery rather than the actual yield, and on the x-axis is the same fishing intensity or exploitation rate. If you look at the total mortality, and this includes bycatch fisheries of roughly 8 million pounds coast-wide, you see that there's actually a slight increase in total mortality, a very marginal increase when you shift from a 32-inch size limit to a 30-inch minimum size limit. And if you look at the spawning biomass, here's one of the potential risks. When you do actually decrease the minimum size limit from 32 inches, you're also going to correspondingly reduce the spawning stock biomass. The reason being is halibut don't mature till they're roughly 11 and a half, 12 years old, and now we're starting to fish them at much smaller ages, so we're going to reduce the number of fish that would recruit into that spawning biomass age with a smaller size limit in the fishery. Yield per recruit, now that we're all getting used to terms like SPR, yield per recruit is another term where you're essentially integrating how much yield an individual halibut would give to the fishery over its lifetime. So another way to think of it is if you had 100 halibut that recruited to the fishery, how many pounds would those 100 halibut translate in over their lifetime? And they would result in roughly 1,700 pounds or 1,500 pounds for those 100 halibut. Yield per recruit actually increases in this case when you reduce the minimum size limit from 32 inches to 30 inches. So what are some of the explicit risks? The risks are foregone yield due to growth overfishing, and I'll explain this in a second. Increased risks of recruitment overfishing. I want to talk a little bit about cryptic mortality because this is a data problem. And then increased wastage due to deliberate shifts in selectivity, and this is particularly problematic when we make assumptions that are violated regarding changes in selectivity. And then I want to show you why there's actually an increased incentive to target smaller, more abundant fish. So it's a pretty natural progression for the fishery to actually target smaller fish when they do, irrespective of price. Growth overfishing is a concept that's been around for 70 years or so in the literature. It's when we harvest a fish at a size such that the yield per recruit is less than the yield that we could have obtained from that fish if we'd allowed it to grow a little bit larger. So if you think of a brand new cohort of fish that enters the population, over time they're going to decay at an exponential rate that corresponds to the natural mortality rate plus the fishing mortality rate. And at the same time they're dying off, they're also physically growing larger. So there's a trade-off there between when you harvest them and what you want to try and do to maximize the yield per recruit is you want to take the product of survivorship and weighted age and find out where that biomass peak curve is and fish at that particular biomass peak curve. Now this is important, especially in Pacific halibut, as we've seen yesterday. The declines in size at age and weighted age in the stock are greater than 50% in most of the areas. One of the things that can happen when you're growth overfishing, does this laser work right there? Press it. One of the problems when you're growth overfishing is if there is a significant shift in the selectivity, which is shown by the small inset panel there. The selectivity shown in blue would be the fishery responding or changing in fishing behavior, responding to a change in the minimum size limit and targeting smaller fish. What happens in this case is that the yield per recruit suffers. You're going to catch a lot less weight per individual fish, and then intensively you're going to forego a future yield as a result of removing those fish before they got to that biomass peak. The risk of recruitment overfishing is similar in the sense that the equilibrium recruitment you would see from a stock when you change the size limit from 32 inches to 30 inches with no shift in selectivity, there's only a marginal change. However, if we make that same change in selectivity, you can see that recruitment declines quite dramatically. You only achieve less than 50% of the recruitment to the fishery, not age one fish, but fish to the fishery when you start to shift your selectivity. So the message here is that if we reduce the size limit and the fishery also starts using smaller hooks and targeting smaller fish, there's a real risk of putting this stock in jeopardy. I want to talk a little bit about cryptic mortality. Fish below the legal size limit, you can't really see on the screen here, but it's a yellow shaded area. It's all less than 32 inches. And anything greater than 32 inches, our current selectivity curve, fish at 32 inches are not fully selected in this fishery. So these sublegal fish, we don't measure them in the fishery. And what happens is we use the ratio of sublegal to legal in our set line survey, multiply that by the commercial catch to figure out how much wastage there is. There's no direct observations or data on wastage in this fishery, with perhaps the exception of Area 2B, where there's a 100% observer coverage and we do measure fish at sea. The concern, the panels on the right here, sorry, on the left here, is essentially if the selectivity remains unchanged, we could see as much as a 50% reduction in the wastage coastwide in these fisheries. However, if the fishery selectivity in the commercial fishery shifts to just 2 inches smaller than we're currently targeting, then the wastage would actually increase in this fishery, and reducing the minimum size limit would actually result in more total mortality, not its intended objective of reducing total mortality. So this is the only concern we really have. The increased incentive to target smaller fish, bear with me for a second, in the top panel, sorry, in the top row, we're measuring the response in fishing effort, FCEY at maximum sustainable yield, the yield per recruit when there's no shift in selectivity. So to maximize the yield in this fishery, it takes about 0.27 units of effort to achieve a 38 million pound average harvest, and you'd on average get about 1.84 pounds per recruit in this fishery. And then the relative CPUE, which is just conditional on whatever the effort is 141 units. If there's a 2-inch shift in selectivity, so CPUE is having a high CPUE is a good thing. Having a low CPUE, you're losing money in the fishery. You're probably just going to tie your boat and not go fishing. So if you shift your selectivity by 2 inches, you can reduce your fishing effort. And the reason being is that in this figure, there's actually scope in our current assumed selectivity in the fishery to target smaller fish that are legal, especially if the sublegal size limit gets smaller. And so you reduce fishing effort, you achieve the same 38 million pound yield, and you get roughly the same yield per recruit, yet the CPUE, or your profits, increase by about 20%. So there's a strong incentive, and this is just catch rates. The other factor on this coin I haven't discussed is what the market prices you're going to get for a 5-pound fish and how that would drive the incentives. So that brings up this idea of a response matrix. We really don't know what's going to happen to fishing behavior and how fishing behavior is going to change in response to a change in the minimum size limit. What we know we can measure, if this does happen, is that we can measure what price we're going to get for a 5 to 10-pound fish. And there's two extreme ranges. One is there could be a really high incentive to discard in the sense that you only get a small fraction of, let's call it $1 a pound for halibut between the 5 to 10-pound range, and then halibut greater than 10-pound plus are $7, $8 a pound. So there's a really high incentive. If you're given a 50,000-pound quota, if you're going out and catching 5-pound fish, you're going to make a fraction of what you would make if you discarded those small fish and only kept the 10-plus fish. So and then what we would measure at the dock is how many 30 to 32-inch fish there are in a catch. So if we saw a few fish in those catch, our conclusions from this change in the minimum size limit are either there's a whole lot of high grading going on, which isn't necessarily a good thing, or fishermen have learned how to avoid catching small fish and they're fishing small fish. We don't collect the data at this current time to resolve between those two hypotheses. If we see a lot of fish and there's a high incentive to discard, and we see a lot of small fish, we would conclude that there's very little wastage, very little high grading, and it's been a successful change in the harvest policy. If there's a low incentive to discard and we see very few fish in the catch, we would actively be avoiding the small fish, or our conclusions would the fisheries actively avoiding small fish. And if there's a lot of fish, this is not necessarily a bad thing either. The wastage is low and you're probably out there trying to maximize your CPUE and not worry about high grading. The reality probably lies somewhere in between these two extremes, and I just wanted to sort of highlight this is the kind of response variables we can currently look at in our fishery. Some of the sensitivities of the assumptions inside this equilibrium model, I'm just going to sort of go through a list here and talk about selectivity, discard mortality rates, bycatch in other fisheries, changes in size at age, and natural mortality. In the Blue Book document, there's a much more fleshed out discussion on these particular issues. I'm just going to show you a table that sort of summarizes how sensitive things are when they increase and decrease. If you look at the column headers here, what we're going to look at for each of the variables, selectivity, bycatch, discard mortality rates, etc., is whether or not it's sensitive, and the number of plus signs indicates no sensitivity if it's a minus, and then the more plus signs there are, the more sensitive the model's outcomes or our harvest policy is to changes in selectivity or changes in natural mortality. There's a column there that talks about whether or not we can measure these variables. So do we even collect the data to measure the response? And then whether or not these sensitivities results in increases or decreases in total mortality, and what is the reason for those increases or decreases. So when we think about fishery selectivity, and we focused on this already quite a bit, it's pretty extremely sensitive. And the unfortunate part is that we can't really measure what the fishery is doing in the Gulf of Alaska because we're not collecting size composition data at sea. We're only collecting size composition data in the directed fishery. Now, I think our new observer program does have some small coverage in the directed halibut fishery, so in theory we could start collecting data or start to see data coming in on fish from the directed halibut fishery. If selectivity decreases, i.e. we're catching smaller fish, it will result in an increase in total mortality vis-a-vis increasing the wastage in the directed fishery. If selectivity were to go the other way and fishermen became more aware of touching fish is actually doing more harm to them in the long term than it does in the short term, you can actually see a substantial decrease in the total mortality rate, and this is simply due to decreased wastage in the directed fishery. Bycatch, you don't really need a model to figure this one out, but if bycatch increases, the way our harvest policy is set up right now is total mortality is insensitive to bycatch. So if bycatch goes from 8 million pounds to 10 million pounds, what the Halibut Commission does is we reduce the FCEY. So when bycatch increases, the halibut quota fishery pays for that, and if bycatch goes down, the halibut fishery increases from that. And this is a joint management issue I'm sure we'll discuss in detail next week. If the size at age continues to decrease or declines, yes, the model is sensitive. We do measure these variables. The results in total mortality decrease, and the reason is that we actually have to fish a lot harder to catch those fish because they're so smaller, and you get more wastage. So we have some limited capacity in how hard we can fish in this fishery. So if they continue to decrease, you just have to fish harder. You do see slight decreases in total mortality. Natural mortality is another variable that is uncertain in our assessments. We usually explore a range of alternative natural mortality rates, and in some of the models now we're trying to estimate these natural mortality rates, and they certainly have probability distributions associated with them. They're very difficult to measure directly in the field, but we do know that if natural mortality decreases, total mortality decreases because we would have to lower the fishing mortality rate in this stock because it's a less productive stock. It's essentially what goes on inside the equilibrium model. So some of these things are intuitive, some of these things are counterintuitive, and again, I want to stress and emphasize that this isn't a dynamic model that's responding to changes. These are the results of long-term equilibrium steady-state conditions. So in summary, the equilibrium model represents a long-term view. It's how our harvest policies are actually designed and developed, not just in the halibut fishery, but fisheries around the globe. And the major concern that we're worried about is how the fishery selectivity would change in response to a change in the minimum size limit. The model that is built here is sort of a coast-wide average model. It doesn't capture the spatial variability. So a lot of things can happen in these fisheries that don't necessarily work out in the equilibrium model. If you don't have spatial overlap in some of these fisheries, or the bycatch fisheries, and we're not accounting for movement among the regions, you could see some variations in the optimum estimates of fishing mortality rate as a response to that. The other thing it assumes that our dynamic assessment models don't necessarily assume is that it assumes the underlying production function is constant throughout time. We have a fixed stock recruitment relationship, fixed natural mortality rate. These things could vary dynamically over time, and our harvest policy would have to be adjusted in correspondence to the changes in those underlying production functions. Reduced wastage directly translates into increased yield on a pound-for-pound basis. For every pound you save in wastage would eventually grow up and become future yield in the fisheries. The problem is that wastage in this fishery is not directly measured through observer programs and 100% observer coverage. It's inferred from the assumptions we make about our set line survey that uses very different traditional gear than what's currently being used in many of the halibut fisheries up and down this coast. There's a real increased risk of growth overfishing and recruitment overfishing with a reduction in the minimum size limit, especially if there's a shift in the selectivity in the fishery. As a response, when you have this potential risk of increased growth and recruitment overfishing, when you reduce the minimum size limit, in order to achieve the same conservation objectives as measured by the spawning biomass depletion, we actually have to lower our target fishing mortality rates. Let me put it in other words for you. The 21.5% and the 16.125% harvest rates may have to be adjusted downwards in response to a reduction in the 30-inch minimum size limit. That being said, Our decision tables this year, remember, are based on the 32-inch minimum size limit. One of the benefits, of course, is instead of catching all those fish at the rail and throwing them overboard, you now get to keep them, so it's going to take you less effort to actually catch your quota. The direction of change in selectivity is really the key to achieving the policy goal of reducing total mortality rate under this assumption. And lastly, I want to remind everyone that changing the size limit strictly is a policy decision. You can adjust the mortality rates to achieve the same management objectives we have for any set of size limits, even no size limit. But it also assumes, in this case, that you're not growth overfishing. So there is some biological constraints to this process. What do we need to learn to make necessary adjustments to the harvest policy? The changes in fishery selectivity, as I've highlighted several times, is key. And what we're missing in this whole program in order for us to judge the effectiveness of changes in size limit is a really good comprehensive at-sea sampling program that's collecting age and size composition data in the commercial fishery. What we're trying to get is information on selectivity below the sublegal size limit or below the legal size limit. So I want to bring you back to the questions I set out at the beginning. Is reducing minimum size limit to 30 inches likely to reduce wastage? The answer to this question is twofold. Yes, if there's no change in fishing behavior and fishing stays the way it was, everybody uses the same gear and they don't start going into areas where there's high densities of small sublegal fish and have higher encounter rates on sublegal fish. The answer is no, is if the fishery starts to deliberately target smaller fish, and it does look like there's some scope to do so, then you could see increased wastage in these fisheries as well. It's really about understanding, as I said in our MSAB thing, how all of these different moving parts play, and the size limit one the selectivity moving part is one of the key components. What's measurable given our current sampling programs? Well, one of the things we're going to be able to measure if this happens is what is going to be the market price for halibut in the 5 to 10 pound size category, and this is a key piece of information as it'll drive the incentives in the commercial fishery. The obvious one is there's going to be a change in the commercial CPUE when you're now, instead of discarding all of these sublegal fish, you're now catching them. It's going to change your weight per unit effort and number per unit effort. We can also measure at our dockside sampling programs the proportion of the catch that consists of the 30 to 32 inch size class. How long would it take to measure a response to a change in the size limit? Well, given the current data collection, we're not going to see any immediate response as expected. We require information on selectivity below the minimum size limit, and had we had that information prior to a change in the minimum size limit, we could actually measure how selectivity changed in response to a change in the minimum size limit. Changes in total mortality would be apparent in the age composition data, but that's going to take at least a generation, so 15, 20 years, before we actually can measure how the fisheries responded to a change in the minimum size limit in terms of its impact on total mortality rates in the stock. This is further confounded with recruitment and recruitment variation that we'll see in the future. So it's difficult to say how long it's going to take, but I would guess at minimum 15 years. Back to the Balsiger question. Is it conservative to reduce the minimum size limit to 30 inches when we're using a decision table that's based on a 32-inch minimum size limit and an apportionment scheme that's based on a 32-inch minimum size limit? This is a really good question, and the answers, sorry Jim, in the 6 weeks I've been working on this haven't really come clear in my head, but I think the hope was that when we reduce the minimum size limit to 30 inches, this would be conservative because it would allow access to a large fraction of male halibut out there that were previously unavailable or in the sublegal size category, and it would be a conservative thing to do. When we looked at the setline survey data, we didn't see those changes in ratios we kind of expected, and we do sex these fish directly, so it's not inferred what that sex composition is. It could be in general, the theory says if you start harvesting fish at a smaller size limit, you should be lowering your target harvest rates. But we're not even sure if our current target harvest rates are at MSY levels or above MSY levels. We don't think so. We've had a pretty good response in terms of the spawning potential ratio that we measure in the fishery. So I think it's probably safe to say this is a really good question, and I don't think it's a dramatic change that would result in too much of a change in total mortality rates in our stock as we've seen it so far. There's bigger issues in bigger, more sensitive areas. So thank you very much for your time and listening this morning. Questions?
I see Jim has a question. Maybe it's the same question he had before.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you naming the question after me, but now I've got a couple of not so good questions, but I'm going to ask them anyway. You said a couple of times, noted that we don't have a direct measurement of wastage, and it's inferred from the setline survey. And then you noted that the setline survey is run with stuck gear, or much of the fishery is prosecuted with snap gear. So is there a staff belief about whether wastage is greater in the snap gear than the stuck gear you're using as a measure, or not as great in the snap gear?
It's a selectivity difference. Yeah, I might defer this one to Ian.
Is this on?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. We don't have a direct estimate of the difference in selectivity between the two gear types, but one of the additional RAW documents this year is an analysis of catch rates comparing snap gear and autoline gear and fixed gear. And one of the things we discovered from that, or we rediscovered from that, it was already documented in previous research, is that the catchability tends to be lower for snap gear than it is for fixed gear. And that doesn't tell us exactly what the response is going to be for small versus larger halibut. One of the important things that came out of that actually we couldn't put in the document because it's confidential information, we spent a lot of time looking at maps of the distribution of the fishery. And what we found was that the smaller vessels tended to use snap gear more often, and that they tended to fish in different areas. The larger vessels using fixed gear tended to fish on the outside edge of the continental shelf much more frequently, farther from shore. This is also one of the reasons why we're not sure that the current observer coverage is going to be very representative of our fishery, because almost half of the fishing effort that goes on occurs in these smaller vessels that are in the unobserved category. So the short answer to your question is that we don't know really what the difference in selectivity is, but there probably is a difference in selectivity between snap and fixed gear, just based on the spatial areas that the two parts of the fishery are accessing.
Thank you. Could I have one more question? So I like the analysis. I think it's great. And I think it's properly predicated on the fact that the fishery is currently having a 32-inch size limit. So much of your stuff was compared to the current fishery, and I think that's the way you have to do the analysis. But did you do enough work, or what else would you have to do if there had been no fishery right now and there is no size limit? What other thing would we do to decide what the proper size limit would be if it was a brand new fishery? Would it be yield per recruit, equilibrium models, or would there be more things you'd look at?
Yeah, under the objective that you're trying to maximize the yield per recruit in the fishery, you would probably have very different harvest rates in different areas just based on the size and age in these animals. We have very small fish in the Gulf of Alaska right now, which historically were much bigger than other areas, and you wouldn't want to wait as long to start fishing those fish as we do in other areas where you see larger growth. They're just going to be dying off faster than they grow, so you would probably want to reduce the minimum size limit in areas where there's smaller fish, or you may want to increase the fishing mortality rate or reduce the selectivity or whatever it's going to be. The sort of additional analysis, I guess, would be required to properly address this harvest policy response, or what is a good procedure to adopt in the absence of critical data that we currently have, would be to test these changes in size limits using more of a management strategy evaluation framework, where we can actually empirically calculate how sensitive the results might be to the current situation, where we have a decision table based on a 32-inch size limit, but we actually fish at a 30-inch size limit. You know, I would like to spend more time addressing and analyzing that question. There's other market demands too that we don't fully understand. I certainly don't understand. If there's no price for a 5 to 10 pound fish, then whatever the fishery does in response to it in the absence of a size limit is they're going to try and avoid smaller fish if nobody's going to pay them for them. And if they're catching small fish just because their size at age has gotten so small, they have really no choice to do what they're currently doing. It's just turn over gear and filter through all the small ones to try and catch the legal size fish. So, you know, the kinds of analysis I would sit down and do would be those sorts of scenarios where you just kind of set up a range of true values and then a whole range of assumed responses to those values, and see, try and test which procedure would be most robust to those things. And it may be to get rid of the size limit, it may be to have a bigger size limit. I have no idea what it would be. So,
Thank you. I think those are really good answers.
yeah, and I have one other answer. The best thing I need to do is to test what response variable should we be measuring to ensure that we're achieving the harvest objectives. And that one I can already answer. We need to measure fish in the sublegal category at sea, what's being caught.
Don, you have a question?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's a very thorough presentation, Steve, and I really appreciate it. This subject has been resurfacing over the years, and it seems with the MSAB, and we're giving it continued thought. I was to understand that the stock male-female ratio and size at age, the basic data is coming from the setline survey, and the response matrix, we talk about high grading. If we were to change the minimum size to 30 inches, I mean, essentially at the 32-inch limit, we're high grading we're already high grading to 32 inches, right. or vessels are moving to an area of larger fish. So, is there a correlation between deliveries? For example, in 3B, the setline survey shows there's so many 32 inches per thousands of pounds of fish on the setline survey. Does that correlate to what the commercial boats are actually delivering to the dock in the 32-inch to the pounds delivered? Are those correlations parallel, or are we already seeing a response from the commercial boats that they're moving to areas of larger fish currently?
I think I'm going to punt that one to Ian, because he's actually looked in more detail at the commercial data.
Well, we can't really make that comparison because we know that the areas that are being accessed by the two fleets do differ slightly. The catch rates tend to be higher across most regulatory areas in the commercial fishery than they are in the setline survey. Because the setline survey is on a fixed 10-mile grid, we're accessing some areas that are just not commercially viable, so our average catch rates do tend to be lower. Where we do get a comparison, and I actually should have mentioned this in response to the previous question, is in Area 2B, because there we've got a logbook record verified by the cameras on those vessels of exactly how many sublegal fish are being encountered. And we use that, in 2B, we use that instead of our setline survey to determine how many sublegal fish are being encountered. Steve didn't mention it, but on that plot that he had showing the range of legal to sublegal ratios by regulatory area, there was a small red line in Area 2B. And it corresponded almost exactly to the median survey station, suggesting that actually the fishery in 2B, for example, which largely uses snap gear, almost all of that fishery is done with snap gear, seems to be encountering almost exactly on average, or at the median, almost exactly the fraction of sublegal to legal fish that we see in our setline survey. Unfortunately, that's not an area that has an extremely high number or high ratio of sublegal fish, and we just don't have that direct comparison in the Western Gulf, for example.
Any more questions, Don?
Steve, does the current observer program provide the information you would need to verify that there had been a reduction in wastage?
Potentially, yes. As I understand it, they do measure a subset of the fish that are discarded at sea. So once we get those data incorporated into the assessment model, there is a potential to estimate the selectivity below 30 or the legal size limit in response to it. The problem, as Ian already mentioned in the observer program, is that I think in the Gulf of Alaska, 53% of our vessels fishing up there, which are responsible for roughly 15% of the catch, are below 40 feet or less than 40 feet in length, and so they're not subject to any observer coverage. So, but they do only harvest about 15% of the total catch in that area.
Any other questions, Bob? No? Dave?
Steve, thank you for a very thoughtful and compelling presentation. I'm a lot more confused about this topic than I was when you started, because I thought I knew what was going to happen. But as you pointed out, some of your results were very intuitive, and some were quite counterintuitive. Under objectives, one of the things that we had discussed in the last year or so was the potential to eliminate, at least to some degree, selective effects, genetic drift, I suppose, in the population regarding growth by going to a smaller size limit so that we wouldn't be selecting for faster growing fish. And I thought that wasn't in your objectives. Did you decide that wasn't going to be too important?
Actually, I didn't speak to it explicitly, but there's some papers we have in press on this subject. The equilibrium model that we've dealt with or constructed for this does deal with the cumulative effects of size-selective fishing, but it doesn't deal with the genetic drift effects. So the idea behind a cumulative effect of size-selective fishing is the reason you see such dramatic changes in size at age when we sample the population every year in our fixed snapshot is that there's a fishery that's out there that's constantly cropping off 32-inch fish. And so all those faster growing individuals die early in life because of fishing. And what remains in the population are the slower growing individuals who have yet to reach 32 inches in size. So this is why you're seeing sort of declines in size at age. Now, if that was the case coast-wide, what you would expect to see is that the areas that have very high exploitation rates would show the largest declines in size at age. Area 2B is an area where we think we've seen the highest exploitation rates since we moved to the coast-wide assessment and have done the apportionment things. There's other issues surrounding that, but that's an area where we estimate there to be very high exploitation rates, and we actually see the opposite trend occurring now, where size at age tends to be increasing in that area. And then area 3A and 3B is an area where we've traditionally had lower exploitation rates, and we see declines in size at age. The other explanation for the data you're seeing is big fish swim farther faster. And so as you grow up and you become a bigger fish, you're just going to migrate further down the coast and get into areas 2C and 2B and what remains behind. But that doesn't explain the historical data in area 3A where we traditionally had the big fish. So it's a very complicated thing. We have a bunch of other hypotheses that are more environmental related and food web related that we're currently exploring through our big NPRB program.
I just have one more question. Thanks for that. So a potential 50% reduction in wastage is pretty compelling from a management point of view, but the concurrent potential for a change in selectivity that would obviate those advantages to the stock in the long run is running counter to that. So I guess everybody needs to consider the fishermen in the room, area by area, whether or not they think that that change in selectivity would take place in their area. Would people put on smaller gear? Would they go looking for smaller fish? And then I guess the follow-up to that is there any regulatory or management tool that we could employ that would prevent that from happening and allow us to take advantage of this potential 50% drop in wastage? And I don't know what the answer is, but maybe somebody can think of something. Thanks, Steve.
Was that last one a question?
Okay, what do we do?
Your question is basically about incentives. I think the lesson I hope I was able to share both through this application we built on the website and in this presentation is that to be a good steward of the resource, you basically want to minimize the amount of contact. Is there regulatory things you could do to create and foster those incentives? I think the answer to that question is yes. We've seen in other fisheries around the world where you have an IFQ or individual vessel quota, is you're allowed to catch and retain whatever fish you catch. But if you catch it and throw it overboard, it comes off your quota. As soon as you put an incentive like that in place, it requires a 100% observer coverage and some sort of enforcement or monitoring system to make sure that there is an accounting structure in place to do so. B, I think it provides a very strong incentive for fishermen to start communicating with each other and say, hey, don't go over there, there's a lot of small fish. And they'll go fish other places where they try and avoid those smaller fish. But what we can do at the Halibut Commission is we can pretty much figure out, given the current size and age, and if we know about fisheries selectivity, or at least there's incentives in place to avoid catching small fish, we can figure out, given the data, what the optimal exploitation rate should be in any given area for current size and age and natural mortality rates. But if nobody's looking, then anything can happen.
So I think you're saying that it would be potentially a good idea to lower the size limit, but not until we have 100% at-sea monitoring for all directed fisheries and individual responsibility for wastage.
Well, the second part of your point there actually applies to the current size limit as well. Remember, we're still, our wastage calculations are still based on the same assumptions. Even if we don't change the size limit, all of the sensitivities I showed you today still apply at a 32-inch minimum size limit. I think we should be doing what you suggested there anyways.
I do too.
Yeah, just 1 second. So, Steve, I had a question too, and I think there's still some more here. You started your presentation talking about some concerns. It was on slide 6. You said, does it make sense to reduce the minimum size limit at a time when trends in coastwide abundance are in decline, mean size at age is declining, age of recruitment to the fishery is getting older? I wasn't sure what weight you were putting on that as you went all through your analysis. I mean, there have been different size limits in this fishery in the past, and it seemed to me that was more of a rhetorical question than it was that was weighted into your thinking about what the impacts were. And in line with what Jim had asked earlier, maybe the more important question is, what is the size limit that would make the most sense in this fishery, regardless of whether it's 32 or 30? And along with the questions that Dave was just asking, what would be the package that would go with that would make the most sense to get the best benefit of all that? Because the objective of the question went back to, I think, what would happen if we adjusted the size limit, and that would reduce the wastage, and it would translate into potentially increased harvest, reduced mortality. So we would have a benefit that would translate into more fish around and more fish to harvest. So I think when the question was posed by the Commission, it was trying to get at the bigger question of, is the current size limit the most appropriate one? And is there one that would be better for overall for the management of the fishery? And it's not clear to me, I guess what I've seen so far, have we done the analysis to address that question? And so here's the question I'm posing to you, and you did speak to it a little bit. What additional work would you undertake to address the question around size limits?
I'll answer the last one first. The whole MSC process is intended to do that. Regarding your first question, what is the appropriate size limit? I'm not the person to ask because it really depends on what the objective is. And moreover, just because you catch more fish doesn't mean you're making more money. I think from the equilibrium analysis we did on here, if they're not paying at least $3 or so a pound for five-pound fish, you'll actually lose money by lowering the size limit in the fishery in the long term. If the price for 10-pound and plus is over $5, so that's essentially where we're at on the price times catch in my very crude economics. Sorry, I took economics with a red crayon. But it really depends on the objective. And if the objective is to sort of minimize wastage, total mortality, I have a complete off-the-wall answer to that one that would probably require another hour. But in short, it's 100% retention in all fisheries. There's so many uncertainties, we don't know what discard mortality rates are. But we can always measure catch at the dock. When we have a fishery in the Gulf of Alaska that I think the Observer Program estimated 39 million pounds of bycatch last year, and we apply a 3.5% discard mortality rate to some of it and 80% discard mortality rates to some of it. These rates are really unknown, but what we do know is that if we retained all of it, we could count it all. You can't count a dead fish on the ocean. So there's a better way to be more efficient in how we utilize the resource, but those are some big policy decisions that are way beyond my pay grade.
I would pose, I guess, the question, though, I mean, we're not really thinking that we'd retain all fish, and it's more along the lines of what Dave spoke about. What would be the incentives to make sure that we're accounting for all the fish, and what the incentives are to reduce some of the impact on the ones that you are releasing? Because it's not just a question about the biology. There is another piece, as you just spoke about, around the economics, and so both those factors need to be considered in making these changes. So I guess what I'd like to hear from you, and yet not right now off the top of your head, it's more thought about what would need to be considered. I think it's not just around the MSC process, it's what we would structure in that process to address that type of question. So I guess what I'm asking, Steve, is to get some thought from you about what steps would be undertaken to address it. But I know that Don has a question as well.
Okay, thanks. I'll defer that to a later time. Don.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. By the way, this discussion you just had about 100% retention was really interesting thought crossed my mind there, so thank you for that. I want to talk a little bit about apportionment and how this might affect apportionment. When I first entertained the idea of reduced size limit, going back to Dr. Balsinger's question of, well, let's just reduce the size limit, maintain a blue line, more or less guidelines, and then would there be a conservation benefit? But if we were to choose to do a 30-inch size limit, we may be able to do that this year, but probably next year we'd have to really look at apportionments and how the 30-inch size limit would affect the available biomass FCY. So have you done any projections as to where that might be? Should we do that next year, where the apportionment, what the effects would be on the apportionment?
We haven't done any analysis of the data, at least that I'm aware of, looking at how the apportionment would change if we based apportionment on a 30-inch size limit. It's pretty obvious when you have an area that has a higher proportion of sublegal fish, you're obviously going to apportion more of the exploitable biomass into the area that has a higher proportion of sublegal fish. Areas that have low proportions of sublegal fish would actually lose out in the apportionment scheme, in theory. Again, those are just the pieces of the pie. The whole pie depends on the results of the stock assessment. So, and I forgot your second question. Okay. So no, regarding what should be done, again, that's, you know, we basically would have to redo the whole harvest policy calculations that were done in the past using our more modern framework, and then adjust the target harvest rates to recalculate what the blue line would be in the decision table. Irrespective, we could go ahead and just do the whole works with a 30-inch size limit and ignore the blue line, and you can still look at the same decision table that would no longer have a blue line in it. It would just have the probabilities of something bad happening for a given catch level in any one of those rows. And you just base your decisions off that. Anything else you want to add to that?
Yeah, go ahead, Bruce.
I'd just like to amplify that a little bit, because I want to come back to what Steve said right at the beginning of the presentation, is that the size limit is a policy issue, and the staff can come up with a harvest policy that's going to address any size limit, including no size limit. But it also depends very strongly on what this industry is looking for out of this fishery. Are you looking for maximizing CPUE? Are you looking for the best average size you can get from these things? And these are all interlocking pieces of a management strategy that you apply to this thing, and that's why the MSE process is so important to trying to go forward with the sort of questions that we're asking right now. I think it's really important that we do have some kind of feedback mechanism with industry so that we can craft the objectives that are actually going to be reasonable objectives for this industry to be looking at.
Thanks, Bruce. Any other questions from the commissioners? Steve, are there any questions on the web?
Yes, Mr. Chair, there's one question from the web from John Youngblood, sorry, and he asks, are the slower growth rates seen evenly throughout the life cycle of the fish, or once a fish hits 30 inches, are we seeing a slowdown in growth? I've always wondered if a slowdown in growth could be heavily influenced by the 32-inch harvest policy, a sort of survival of the fitter.
The short answer to his question is we really don't know. We don't track individual growth of an individual over its lifetime. We are starting to look at growth increments on the otoliths, which would impute what the growth rate was of an individual. My experience with those sorts of things is they generally have a growth curve. Sometimes you see seasonal effects associated with warm and cold temperatures, but there's just a distribution of faster growing individuals and slower growing individuals. The size at age data we collect, we do look at those individuals, and then we also looked at whether or not fish that have a prior hook injury would be on the low side of the size at age individual. We don't see that. The size at age with prior hook injuries are all over the place, but it's difficult to determine whether growth rates have slowed down once you've had a prior hook injury. and we haven't looked at those fish yet. So thank you for the question.
All right, if there's no other questions on the webcast, I was going to see if there's questions or comments from the audience. Let's see, go ahead.
It's more of a comment, and it's directly related to our fishery in 2B and our longline fisheries in particular, where we actually have to retain all rockfish in our longline fisheries in 2B, and they're totally accounted for in different things as we go through. And as a fisherman, it actually makes us adjust to the rules. That's how we're taking our halibut, those types of things. And it's been pretty effective in, as we see, in the management of the rockfish resource through the catch levels that are there. But when it actually comes to how we take our halibut, at times we're fishing in places where we maybe wouldn't necessarily choose to do so because we're forced to conform to the rules. So when you look at a lot of the questions, I mean, I think you can look to 2B and you could get a lot of the answers as to, you know, what observer programs and all these things and the effects that it actually has. One of the questions that I have is, I mean, we know that the size of the age has changed throughout the years, different things, and we know that the size limit has changed. So if we look back at the past and the recent peak that we had in the halibut stock was resulted after the increase in the size limit, have you looked at how all of that could have maybe corresponded to if that size limit would have stayed the same and we carried on through with all the normal environmental factors which are beyond our control?
Yeah, that's a great question. We haven't looked at that. We do have, through the web-based tool, we have played around with the ideas of increasing the size limits to see what the corresponding response would be, and what you get without any changes in fishing behavior is you actually get increases in total mortality associated with increased wastage in the fishery. You bring up probably the key point on this whole thing is what the management system has done in Area 2 is really changed the incentive landscape for individual fishermen out there to act in a more rational behavior towards conservation of the resource. When you have, the way our process works is we're calculating the total biomass available to be harvested, and the first thing we do is we deduct off the wastage for the entire community. So there's no incentive for an individual to behave rationally because the wastage was already taken care of. And I think that's the major difference between the two management landscapes, is that there's a very different incentive structure in Area 2B. It's very hard to say what would happen in Area 2A, or in 3A.
Yes, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Linda Benkin with Alaska Longline Fishermen's Association. This has been a really interesting discussion and I think an excellent analysis. This idea has a lot of appeal to us because we all want to find ways to reduce wastage. But I think one of our biggest goals, you asked where the industry, or Bruce asked where the industry stands on our objectives for stock management, would certainly be to rebuild stocks and protect that spawning biomass. And the risk that this poses to those goals certainly gives me a lot of concern. One of the questions, or one of the sort of counterintuitive pieces of it to me, or I think a takeaway for me anyway from your presentation and the research, is that the risks really come from any changes in fishing behavior that would put more pressure on small fish. And yet, when you look at where this might take us with apportionment, you indicate that we would apportion more of the total quota to those areas with the small fish, area 3B, for example, which to me seems like then it de facto puts more pressure on those small fish if you're increasing effort in those areas. So I just wondered if you could comment on that, if I'm misunderstanding that, or if there's some way to accomplish those goals without sort of incentivizing that shift or causing that shift to more pressure on the small fish.
Sure. I think your intuitions are correct. We would, absent any other changes and only a shift in selective or only a shift in the size limit and reapportioning based on that new size limit, that you would put under the current harvest rate portfolio we use, we would put more pressure on the resource doing that. However, I think what this analysis would have to include would be the apportionment, and then you would also have to adjust area-specific harvest rates to ensure you're not growth overfishing in an area, which would put the whole stock in some sort of jeopardy. So in an area where you would apportion more of the biomass, because the composition of that biomass has a higher proportion of immature fish, you would have to have a much lower harvest rate in that area to alleviate the pressure that you pointed out. Thank you, Linda.
Are there more questions on this topic?
Bob?
So Steve, in 1980, mid-80s, size at age is radically different than what it is now. I'm getting the sense that a 30-inch size limit at that time would be counterproductive to our interest here. So does size and age need to be a factor at all times in determining whether what size limit we should embrace?
Yeah, the harvest policy, or any optimum harvest policy where you're trying to maximize yield or yield per recruit, involves natural mortality, fishery selectivity, and growth. So size at age is a key component, and then if it's MSY based, you also need to know the stock recruitment relationship with productivity. But just from a yield per recruit curve, growth, size at age, and natural mortality are the three variables that, am I missing anything yet? Yeah, those three variables. So in the 1980s, when these fish grew fast, and having a 32-inch size limit probably wasn't, anything to really worry about. They recruited the fishery all at less than 8 years old or close to 8 years old, and as the size of the age is becoming smaller and smaller, what we're doing now is shifting from a catch and retain fishery to a catch and turnover fishery, where we're burning through a lot of small fish that haven't reached, that now takes 6 years longer to reach that minimum size in the case of the males, and 3 to 4 years in the case of the females. So you're actually, it's possible that you could catch a male halibut 6 times, for example, before it was actually legal to keep it. If you think about where selectivity is operating and what is the legal size. Female halibut maybe 3 or 4 times.
All right, thanks. Back to the floor.
Thank you for your presentation. So if we immediately lowered the size limit, let's say just coming out of this meeting, would that mean the exploitable biomass would just immediately increase?
No, the proposal on the table is to maintain the decision table, as I understand it, at the current 32-inch size limit. So all of the FCEY calculations that would come out of this meeting and that would be adopted would be based on the 32-inch size limit. But when the fishery is actually prosecuted, if they change the size limit, you would be allowed to retain 30 to 32-inch fish.
Well, so okay, so then for the purpose of this meeting, the exploitable biomass would remain as what we're assuming it to be right now. But so going forward during the harvest of the next season, the 30 to 32-inch fish would be part of the exploitable biomass in that case. Is that true?
Correct.
Okay. And then, so then part of my question with that is, you would assume a lower average weight across the fishery.
Correct.
And then in that case, we would have a higher number of fish being harvested in this next year than we were assuming under a 32-inch level.
Correct.
Okay. And so are there ramifications of that, or is that something that's built into the stock assessment models, or is that a consideration?
Well, the ramifications of it in the presentation is there's the potential to forego yield in the future through growth overfishing. So if you're harvesting fish too small today, you're going to forego that potential yield you would get in the future if you stood back and waited. That's further exacerbated if the fishery selectivity starts targeting smaller fish, so you'll forego even more yield into the future. If the fishery selectivity didn't change and you started harvesting 32-inch fish, there's a trade-off there between wastage savings and the yield you're foregoing. So they may be balanced out to be equal. They may be, and if that's the case, if they're equal, you're catching the same amount of fish but lowering the overall total mortality in the stock, which is a good thing.
Okay. Yep. And then, but as you pointed out, we can't measure that.
Correct.
Okay. Thank you.
Are there any other questions yet? I see one more gentleman.
Yeah, good morning. Lyle Pierce, 2B Fisherman. I'm kind of curious. I mean, you're talking about reducing and lowering the size limit so we're catching less fish. Bruce, has there been any discussion on maybe trying to alter the gear and go to a size 18 hook over a 16 and what the effects of possibly altering the gear as opposed to trying to change the size limit could do?
I think there has been quite a bit of discussion about that, and in one of Steve's slides, I think it was one of your slides, Steve, you had actually what would happen if the selectivity shifted the other way, and that's one of the things that we can examine for that, and actually that's something that does actually to reduce wastage, but it changes the efficiency of the fishery as well. Steve, you want to comment any more on that?
Yeah, if the proposal would be to regulate the hook size used in long line gears, then it could potentially shift the selectivity the other directions where the gear is only catching larger fish. It would certainly reduce wastage in this case, but again, as fish grow and get older, they also die before they get a chance to recruit there. So your CPUE in the fishery would probably drop. Whether or not it drops enough to offset the costs you get from a larger average weight in your catch, I'm not sure, but that's the potential savings from a conservation perspective. That's a no-brainer, but it may not be economically feasible for the industry to do that.
All right. I'm going to suggest that we take a break now. It's 10 after 10, that we get back at 10:25 and move on to the next section around bycatch. Thanks very much.
We got another ex-commissioner here now.
Oh, Cliff.
Didn't be there yesterday. Cliff.
Yeah.
All right, thanks for getting back. We do have 4 main items in this particular section around bycatch. The first is the Halibut Working Group Bycatch 2 report, which is on the website. If you haven't had a chance to read it, or you can go onto the IPHC website and locate a copy and download the document, which was about 2 years in development. The other item that we're going to talk about is the February 5th meeting that's coming up with the North Pacific Fishery Management Council. We are also going to have a discussion in a room for a discussion around regulatory proposals that Heather presented yesterday. And as well as I mentioned this morning, earlier this morning, that there will be time provided for the Alaska Seafood Cooperatives to 30 minutes for them to provide basically a presentation to the Commission around their plans for reduction of halibut incidental catch and in their fisheries. So, and then there will be time provided for public comments as well, as we usually do in these meetings. I'm going to start with the Halibut Working Group bycatch report, and they're going to turn to Bob that's going to provide a few comments. Bob and David Boyce were the two Canadian commissioners that were on the working group that helped shepherd that document through into completion. So I'm going to turn it over to you now, Bob, for a few comments.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. The bycatch working group had a report that was just about completed. It had a draft. It was before the North Pacific Council and the Commission for about 2 years, and then David Boyce and I were at last year were put in charge of trying to finalize this. The Commission has accepted the final report this last fall. It's up on the website. I'll just give some brief rundown of it. Many of the action items that were discussed over the last 2.5 years in developing this have been eclipsed by actions in the North Pacific Council, and I'll point that out. One of the goals was to improve the validity of the observer estimates of the halibut bycatch through a new observer deployment model, and the Council implemented their program in 1913. My thing just went blank. Excuse me.
Password expired.
Oh, there we go. Okay, and then that program is subject to annual reviews and changes, and has gone through 2 of those changes going into the 2015 season. Another element was assessing the feasibility of electronic monitoring. The Council is doing field through National Marine Fisheries Service is doing field experiments this year. Some field experiments next year with adaption, and we'll be looking at a amendment to allow financing through their observer program of a portion of so that some of the portion of the fleet will have electronic monitoring 2017. The Commission's report also looked at reducing bycatch in the Gulf of Alaska, and that came on the heels of some previous action of the Council, where in 2012 they reduced the bycatch limit in the Gulf of Alaska by 15%, and then there's discussion in this report that on how to reduce in the Amendment 80 fleet based on the Govan presentation you'll hear later today on their experimental fishing permit with the use of grates or deck sorting. A lot of these recommendations in the Bering Sea have been eclipsed by the Council activity, which is going to be hopefully finalizing some reductions at their Sitka June meeting this year. So that completes my comments, Mr. Chairman. The report has been finalized. It's up on our website, and a lot of the recommendations have been mirrored by actions that the North Pacific Council is taking or
upgrading.
Thanks very much, Bob. David, did you have some comments?
I would encourage everybody to take a look at this report. There was 4 objectives: to gain a better understanding of the amount of halibut bycatch occurring in each regulatory area, to gain a better understanding of the impact of bycatch on the conservation and allocation of the halibut resource and on the available harvest, to explore options for reducing the overall level of halibut bycatch, and finally to explore options for mitigating the impact of bycatch in one regulatory area on the available harvest in other regulatory areas. To a greater or lesser extent, these objectives were addressed in the report. There's a lot of information there. I think the one takeaway that I'd like to leave you with, if you don't have time to actually read it, is that in Area 2B and then subsequently in Area 2A, very substantial reductions in halibut bycatch in the trawl fishery were achieved by going to a system of individual vessel quotas and individual accountability for bycatch. This is something that works, and so from my point of view, I'm hoping that this approach will be adopted in Alaska, in the Gulf in particular, as soon as possible. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks very much, Dave. Maybe just to embellish a bit upon Dave's comments, if I could for a minute. Dave, what you were speaking about was, if you took a look what bycatch limits or bycatch amounts were back in 1991 and 2A and look at what they are today, there's been reduction of 70%. And if you look similarly in Area 2B over the same period, look what it was in 1991 and look at it what it is today as amounts, you see that bycatch has been reduced by 90% since 1991. So there definitely can be ways to reduce the bycatch, and that definitely does have impacts on halibut in the positive way. And that's I think, good segue into the next discussion around the meeting with the North Pacific Fishery Management Council. Really are pleased as a commission to be meeting with the council in I guess in a formal way, but we've also had informal discussions leading up to setting up this meeting, which really has helped craft the agenda a bit between the council and the commission. And through those discussions, the intent is to further understanding around what the impacts are of bycatch, but also how we can improve upon the overall management of all fisheries that have an impact. And with that, I think we now have the agenda up on the screen there for you to take a look at. And I was going to ask Bruce Lehman to walk us through the agenda that we've agreed upon for the February 5th meeting. We spent a fair amount of time as a group working with the council, coming up with this agenda and the topics on it. And I'm going to ask Bruce to walk through it. We have set aside, a significant part of the day of February 5th, and I believe it starts at 10 a.m. And we've scheduled, well, hard to know how many comments there might be, but somewhere maybe around 5 we might get through the agenda. So, as I say, I'm really pleased to have these discussions with the council and look forward to that meeting on February the 5th. So, Bruce, maybe if you could walk us through the agenda.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. The agenda is up on the board in front of you, and to iterate a bit about what Paul was just saying, with Chairman Hall and Chairman Ryall together, as along with Chris Oliver, the Executive Director of the Commission, and myself, we've tried to work through a number of elements here that we thought could be done in the space of time we have available to us, and then also is going to be meaningful to both the Commission and the Council. And of course, this arose primarily out of concerns about bycatch and how we might be able to use complementary authorities to try and achieve some joint goals in this. But the agenda items you'll see here, the second one is looking at the levels of cooperation, because I think there's sometimes a perception that there isn't as much cooperation between the Commission and the Council and National Marine Fisheries Service as there is, and there's really quite an astounding amount of cooperation that probably isn't necessarily apparent to folks, and so we do want to actually go through some of these things and show you how we are working together on solving some problems right now. There is quite a bit of joint work between the three bodies, and I think it'd be useful for people to understand that. John Pollard from the National Marine Fishery NOAA Office of, I don't know what it is, in legal counsel anyway, has prepared a very short thing looking at the relative authorities of the two bodies. Now, that's not something we really want to focus on a lot, but we should at least be clear about the relative authorities that the two bodies have. The second part of this agenda is looking at some current issues here, and the first one is reconciling some bycatch estimates, and what you heard yesterday from Dr. Stewart in his presentation about the expressions we had at our interim meeting about whether or not the bycatch estimates that were being used are correct, and so he did try to outline those for you. The second part that came out of that was a desire on the part of the Commission staff to work with the regional office and the observer program so that we can actually partition the bycatch better than we can right now, because there's a mismatch between NMFS management areas and IPHC statistical areas. So what we're going to try to do over the next year is to try to get to an agreed set of protocols about how we will partition the data and how we will estimate those numbers when it comes to putting it into our stock assessment, as also as reporting by National Marine Fisheries Service. The second part of this is looking at improved estimates of discard mortalities and the discard mortality rates, how those are applied in fisheries. We think we have a fairly mature process about how discard mortality rates are applied and estimated in the Alaskan fisheries, but the Commission is interested in research right now, and there are some joint proposals before the National Fish and Wildlife Federation as well as the North Pacific Research Board, looking at using new technologies to try to actually ground truth some of these mortality rates that are being applied. So that's a key component of this, because many of the survival estimates that we're using are keyed across looking at the survival of the excellent quality fish, and many things are keyed off that. So what we're trying to do is we've reviewed the historical basis for this, and we're reasonably comfortable with the conclusions that were made at that time, but it's also clear we need to revisit this. So this will be looking at a research program for this. Item number 5 is looking at current management measures and issues of mutual interest. Ian will be doing a presentation on our total mortality accounting framework that he's been briefing you on over the last day and a half or so. We're also looking at the council staff. Diane Evans will be presenting the package that's being put before the council on looking at the BSAI halibut PSC reduction package. And then a third part of this is looking at a part that the Commission staff has been generating, which is looking at abundance-based PSC limits, and this is a background paper that we're just floating by our commissioners right now, and that'll be distributed. So some of this information hasn't come out in quite as timely a fashion as we had hoped to, but there were other elements that kind of impeded our progress on this. So these are the main items that we're going to be talking about, and then we'll branch into some broader discussions of mutual interest in both looking at bycatch reduction packages as well as the research programs that might contribute to that. So, Mr. Chairman, that's a general thing.
Okay, thanks very much for that run-through on the agenda for February the 5th. The other component within this section, Heather provided a presentation yesterday morning, you might recall, around regulation proposals. Now we can bring that presentation back up. I wasn't planning on going through it again, but we're going to provide the opportunity, if you have any questions around any of those regulation proposals, for questions or comments that you may have on those. But before we go to that particular section, as I mentioned that we are going to have a presentation. We've provided 30 minutes, and there's two gentlemen, John Govan and Mark Finna, that I'm not sure if they're both going to be speaking, but yes, okay. And so with that, I would turn the floor over to you, and once they're completed, we'll come back and probably have a few comments maybe from the commissioners, and then we'd be providing an opportunity for public discussion and comments and questions.
Thank you. Sounds like it's working. I work with the Alaska Seafood Cooperative. I work for one of the member companies, and we're here obviously because of the bycatch issues in the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands. We fish flatfish, rockfish, cod, ack mackerel in the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands. Our group has a long history of working on bycatch issues. We started pretty aggressively working on bycatch in the late 90s and early 2000s with a good amount of research on the use of excluders and excluder development. That carried through the 2000s, and in 2008 our fisheries were rationalized under the program Amendment 80, which you may have heard of. That program allocates target species as well as halibut and other PSC, which we're required to discard. Since that time, we've been working to fine-tune excluders, and also under Amendment 80, we've kind of developed in working together. We communicate much more on the grounds than we used to in terms of telling people where you're seeing high bycatch rates and what kind of fishing there is and what kind of bycatch you're finding on the grounds. To get to the point that has us here, in June of last year, the North Pacific Council took up an action to amend, to consider revising our bycatch limits and halibut limits. At the time, they were focused largely on the issue in 4C D&E that you've heard so much about over the last few days and the decline in the catch limits in that area. One of the things that they asked us to do as a part of that package, as a part of the discussion of the package, they asked the fleet to take a voluntary cut of 10% from the 5-year average use of halibut in the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands. So our co-op looked at our numbers and after the meeting and developed a plan to reduce our bycatch from July to December by 10% from that 5-year average. We managed to meet that requirement and exceed it by a little. We also, well, that didn't work. We managed to meet that requirement, exceed it by a little. So when we came to the IPHC's interim meeting last year, we were a little bit surprised to find that the 4C DE fishery was taking another hit because of bycatch. It turns out that what had happened is we'd kind of been focused on the wrong thing when it came to adjusting our bycatch to address that area. We'd been focused on a Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands wide cap as opposed to what's happening only in 4C D&E. And also there's another factor that comes into play, which is over 26 fish come directly off the TAC or off the catch limit as opposed to more of a general treatment of all species. So we weren't particularly focused on over 26, and we weren't focused on 4CDE fish specifically. So although we met our target, we walked in the room and weren't greeted quite so happily as we had hoped. Part of what did happen is we saw a substantial uptick in our bycatch in 4CDE. Typically we're around 80%, say, in those areas, and we found that last year it was closer to 90%. Also some of the change in the composition. So the council met shortly after that meeting and suggested at the time that they consider an emergency rule to cut halibut limits by 33% in order to give the 4CDE catch limit, to establish a 4CDE catch limit of 1 million pounds. That motion on that to ask for the emergency failed. Shortly thereafter, 6 council members, through a letter from the state of Alaska, asked the agency to consider that. But also in the letter, what they suggested is industry could come together and put some voluntary proposals on the table that may be able to address this problem without an emergency action. So that's why we're here talking to you now. And sorry to go on so long about that. We've put together a package. There's a paper that is, I know there were copies of it outside. Some were handed out to the commissioners as well, and we can make more copies if folks need it. But they go through, if you flip through the paper, it does the background, covers the background which I just gave you. It also covers descriptive, it's got some descriptive text about what actions we're taking within our co-op this year. And it also has an agreement at the back of it. I'm going to touch on a few of the things that are in the agreement. John Govan will speak to 2 particular items in the agreement, and then I'll probably speak a little bit in conclusion as to where we're headed directly. The 2 first items are excluders and deck sorting, and those are John's. And then the following items that we are looking at in our agreement. One of the most effective things we've found for reducing bycatch is communication on the grounds. Our captains work with each other. They're on the radio consistently talking to each other about what bycatch rates they're seeing and what target fisheries, where they're finding those bycatch rates. And we intend to continue those efforts and redouble them this year. We also are looking at, with a much harder focus on 4CDE halibut and over 26 halibut, because we know the direct effect they have on your catch limits. So within our group, we're working with this communication. We also weekly, at a minimum, will be discussing as a group how we're performing in the fisheries and looking at our numbers to try to see what kind of savings we're able to make. In terms of those meetings, we'll also be discussing what strategies are effective. One of the difficulties we have with reducing bycatch is that with the distribution and composition of the stock of both our fisheries and the halibut stocks, and some of the uncertainties as to those distributions, we can't pinpoint and say here's a very clear number that we can get for savings out of our communication, or even the other measures. John is going to speak a little bit more to that on some of the other issues that we're looking at. We also, some of our fisheries have higher bycatch rates at night. We're working to limit the amount of night fishing we do, particularly in those fisheries. We also are going to be producing charts on a regular basis that show where you're observing halibut and where we're finding halibut in the different target fisheries, and sharing those among our members to make sure that we know where we're finding high bycatch and we can avoid it. We use small tows at the beginning when you're starting to set in an area and try and figure out what's happening in a particular area. Use small tow so that if there are halibut in the area, you keep the numbers down and you move. It gives you the opportunity to move before you do damage. We have been successful in the past reducing halibut. We feel that last year's effort demonstrates that we can be successful in meeting targets that are put before us. And we hope we're given that opportunity again, and we hope you all take that into consideration when you take up your catch limits. John is going to speak a little bit to excluders and to deck sorting, which are tools that we will be using. We're not sure how far, and then I'll probably wrap up with a brief summary.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm usually nervous about people wearing a wire. Now I'm wearing one. So I'd like to just give you a little progress report on the use of excluders in the flatfish fisheries in the Bering Sea for the fleet I work with, which are catcher-processor vessels, the primary users of this resource. You know, for years the captains tried some of these hard grates and vertical grates to just do size sorting, and encountered one main issue. They clog up and the surface area is limited, so you lose a lot of target catch. In recent years, I think we have a better mousetrap that's been developed. We call it the reverse hallway excluder, or the green line excluder. That's kind of a trade name for it. But this one has significantly more surface area. Some of them are as long as 60 feet, and it's a double panel that's expanded with water kites to allow a difference in room between the two panels, and it works on the principle of what doesn't go through that middle panel actually just goes out. So it has a lot of promise. Some of the captains that are using it are finding that the loss rates for target fish are lower than the other excluders they've used, but typically they're still around 20 to 30% of target catch, which means you got to tow longer. So you have to use an excluder where it makes sense to use. The 6 and 7 inch internal panel is designed around the different fisheries, and the yellowfin fishery use the smaller ones so the yellowfin can swim through that panel and the halibut won't. Use the 7 inch in the flathead fishery and maybe a narrow tooth. But anyway, the news here is that I think we're going to step up our efforts to use these excluders. We definitely in our captains meetings have brought forward information from those who are using them, and I think there's some promise. I view the excluders as sort of the first line of defense. It's the best way to reduce halibut mortality because you don't actually catch the fish. But if you do catch some, and you're still going to catch some when you're fishing in these target fisheries, you can use deck sorting. And I'd just like to give you a little summary of sort of what this is about. I know you've heard a lot about deck sorting. I do have a PowerPoint. I won't boot that up unless there's time at the end, Mr. Chairman. And I think there's other members of different parts of the industry, so we're trying not to use it too much time here. But I have had a lot of questions from fishermen. How's this deck sorting going to work? Is it really going to get the fish back? How are you going to verify the viability of those fish? So just to understand, on our boats, CP fleet, we're not currently allowed to sort anything from the deck. So the catch handling procedures that are in place require that we put everything into a stern tank. That has to come into the factory, go over a flow scale. There's 2 observers working on our boats at all times, and when it sorts through the factory, it can go back in the water. Unfortunately, that's a great way to get a good accounting of the fish we catch through basket sampling, but it means that the fish can be out of the water for 2 to 4 hours in some cases, which is not good for the viability of those halibut. So you have this trade-off between the accuracy of catch accounting and that objective and the objective of reducing the mortality of the halibut we catch. So it's really important that we still, if we are going to sort halibut on the deck, we still get good information on how much halibut we're catching and the viability of those halibut. So our co-op has done 2 exempted fishing permits in the past, 2009 and 2012. Just to summarize what we did, we basically used sea samplers to account on deck for the halibut that we sorted out of the cod end. The cod end was pulled forward of that hatch. The crew sorted out the halibut, routed it to a chute where the sea sampler was working. The sea sampler measured the fish and its viability. In 2009, they tried to measure every one and do a viability. They soon saw that slowed things down and actually reduced the viability. So in 2012, we used a sampling approach, randomly sampling those fish. The results were, I believe, important in terms of reduction potential. In 2009, our EFP focused on fisheries that the captains thought were well suited to deck sorting, small cod ends, and the size of the halibut large compared to the target fish. We were able to achieve a 45% mortality rate for the fish we sorted on deck. That is compared to about 80% in the normal fishery, so a fairly significant reduction there. In 2012, our study focused on more challenging fisheries, bigger cod ends, smaller halibut, harder to sort. We were able to achieve for the halibut sorted on deck a 57% mortality rate, which is, again, a significant reduction from what those fisheries normally get. And so we were planning to come back in 2016 with another EFP application that actually used a flow scale on deck to weigh the halibut to speed and facilitate getting them back in the water. With what's going on with halibut in the Bering Sea, we asked the agency for an expedited exempted fishing permit, if you will, in 2015. We won't have those scales on deck, but we will have the opportunity to use sea samplers much as we did in 2012. The methods are very close, but the 2 main differences really are that we're going to make this deck sorting available as a catch handling option or alternative for the boats. One of the biggest problems we had in the earlier EFPs is that if you have to deck sort on every tow, you soon come into weather conditions that mean you can't fish. And so what the captain said was, there are a lot of times I could do this, but if I had to do it on every tow, I just can't do this. So what this will do is make it available on an option. They'll have to notify the sea sampler, we're going to deck sort this tow. And so they will be able to use it when it makes sense to use it. They'll focus on larger, more viable fish, and I think it won't slow things down too much. One of our concerns going into this, however, is the availability of these sea samplers. Our boats, as Mark mentioned, have 2 fishery observers. To do this 24 hours a day, we're going to need 2 extra bodies, 2 sea samplers who have the same qualifications as observers. The availability there is quite limited at times during the year, so we also have an option to use 1 sea sampler and only do the deck sorting while that sea sampler is on deck and on duty. So I think this is going to be a very productive area to focus for reducing halibut mortality, but we are cautious because we have not expanded this to our entire co-op set of vessels, and we do have 18 active vessels. This would do that, but it brings in the need for a large number of sea samplers. We're going to have to work with the observer providers to be able to get these people trained and up and doing this. So in summary, I think this is going to be productive. I view the excluders as our first line of defense. They'll use them and do the deck sorting when they can get the proper manpower in terms of sea samplers. And I believe both of these will be the sort of the main thrust of how we can reduce our halibut mortality in 2015. Thank you. And so Mark's going to come up. I'm removing my wire.
So the question we've heard all week has clearly been kind of where are you headed in your PSC usage or your halibut usage, and it's one that we have spent an inordinate amount of time talking about. After we heard about this problem, and once we became aware of this problem, we spent a few days going back and forth with the staff of the IPHC. I want to thank them for how much they worked with us on this and how much effort they put into helping us understand and there's a single sheet that I believe is passed out up there. I don't know if it's been distributed. There should be other copies in the back and we can make more, but this kind of summarizes kind of where we see things standing. We looked at the Alaska letter for the emergency as being kind of the starting point for considering what kind of fishery they're trying to set up, and their target was a 1 million net pound fishery. To get to a 1 million net pound fishery, there needed to be, I believe it was around 480,000 net pound increase from the blue line estimate this year. And that meant that you needed to find, and I'm just going to summarize quickly, 454 metric tons of bycatch savings. That assumes the constant distribution, a similar distribution of over 26, under 26, as there has been in the past few years, in last year. And we looked at it as a sector and looked at the overall halibut bycatch mortality in Area 4C DE in 2014. That was 2,753. We looked at our sectors, or our co-ops bycatch mortality. That was 1,319. And that's that we come out roughly at 48% of the halibut bycatch. So you are talking to the right people. If we apply that percentage to the 454, it means our proportional share of the reduction that people hope to achieve is 217 metric tons. As John mentioned, last year we looked at what we did. We think we made significant headway in halibut reduction through the end of the year, as was requested by the council. We are hopeful that the 217 is a number that we'll be able to hit, but we don't know if we can. We don't know what our deck sorting permit is going to look like. We don't know that for certain that it's going to allow us to use one sea sampler. And there is a shortage of sea samplers, as John alluded to. We also will use all the other tools that we have and that we've talked about to try to get to that number, and we'll do the best we can. And just to conclude, I feel like about a year and a half ago when I took a job at the company I'm with now, I thought I was going to work with a flatfish company and a flatfish, cod, rockfish, active mackerel company, and I would say, based on the last month, I feel like I work exclusively for a halibut avoidance company, and it's been my job for the last month. So we are taking this very seriously, and we know it's important to you, and it's important to the managers in these fisheries, and we will continue to work on this. And we will be giving it attention every day and every week through the year.
All right. Thanks very much, Mark and John, for your collective presentation and the consideration of how you would adjust to make some improvements. I'm going to see if there's any questions first from commissioners for either of you. Don?
Yeah, Mark and John, thank you for that presentation. Can you give me a sense of your 18 boats in your cooperative are all trawlers, and are they fishing 6 months a year, 8 months? How through the year? How much are they on the grounds?
They are all trawlers, and they fish probably on the order of 9 to 10 months a year.
All right, Bob.
John, I wanted to compliment you for a decade and a half of working on this effort. And I have the original report from '96 that suggests, I think your 57% works out right, close to a 40-45% reduction in mortality, or going from 85 to 50 or something like that. Has there been any new viability studies with the EFPs you've been working with since then? It was a question I had, and I know going to extruders and redoing a fleet is not an instantaneous situation. So throughout the year, how much of the sector you're representing might have these new excluders for the flatfish that you were talking about?
Yeah, thanks, Commissioner Alverson. On the first question of the mortality, both EFPs we did use the current methods that observers use in the trawl fisheries to assess the viability of the halibut. That's done in the regular fishery as well, but in the EFPs we did the viability sampling at a high rate to get better information from the sample of halibut we were handling, because that's what our focus was. But we used the same methods that are in place. Our co-op is working with Craig Rose and the Halibut Commission on a proposal that we submitted to put accelerometer tags in halibut and actually validate these the survival rates. And so if that research gets funded, I think there will be new information, but our EFPs used the existing methods that are in place for the trawl fishery to assess viability with higher sampling, so we would be for sure able to look at how deck sorting affected the. The other thing we did was we actually calculated time out of water, and we're able to develop a function, and if there's time at the end, I actually have a slide that shows how time out of water affects viability from our EFP, which I think you'll find interesting. On the excluder question, all of our boats use different types of excluders, and captains have, with their different fishing sizes, the different fishing styles, have used different ones that seem to work best for them. What we've been doing is getting the word out that those who are using the green line, the reverse hallway, are having better success, and so we've started a dialogue on that. I think most of the companies have tried every kind of excluder out there, but what we've been focusing them on is the formula within that green line one that seems to be working with the grid size that's used. So I think we're just really focusing them on, this is the performance that some boats are getting, and are you doing this well? So if not, go talk to the captain of this boat who's getting those results.
So one follow-up question.
Yes, go ahead, Bob.
You mentioned that the tows would be shorter during these. So what would the difference in a tonnage of a tow be versus 5 years ago, 4 years ago, and what is being practiced in this EFP?
So I think Mark's reference to the shorter tows was as a test tow in an area when you first get to an area to look at the abundance of halibut relative to the target fish to make sure why make a long tow when you can find that out with a short tow? But generally, I have noted since Amendment 80 started, and we have a limited amount of target fish to catch and a limited amount of bycatch, I think the companies generally are trying to catch less in a haul, and that's for quality reasons for the target fish. So I remember when I first started, it was not uncommon for some of the bigger boats to bring up a 40 or 50 ton cod in, and that still goes on in some boats, but generally in the the 30-ton range is what the boats are targeting because the quality of the target fish is higher. So that means a shorter tow time, and that works well with deck sorting. When the boats did deck sorting in the EFPs, they shortened up their tow time to increase the viability of the halibut, and that's what I would expect with deck sorting as well.
Don?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. My last question. I'm reading through your report we were provided, and I noticed the daylight hours. I'm trying to correlate if fishing during the daylight hours seems to help with a reduction in the bycatch rate. Is the bycatch rate constant through the 10 months, 9-10 months that your fleet fishes? And then, of course, it's Alaska, so the winter months don't have much daylight available to use. I'm just wondering, are you seeing like from March to September when there's much more daylight, does that help reduce your bycatch rate, or is it staying pretty constant through the fishing season that your boats are out there?
Okay, I guess I get that one too. Obviously, there are certain fisheries that the captains have noted higher bycatch rates at night, and so those are the ones they're targeting. We don't see that relationship in all the fisheries, but I would say flathead sole, you definitely see a big increase at night. So that's a summer fishery. So the boats can do the fishing they need to do during the daylight hours and not get those dusk and dawn tows. They seem to be able to, reduce the amount of halibut. So that's really what they're targeting there. I don't think that relationship holds in all seasons, really. I mean, obviously there isn't that much daylight and night. So, but I think that's really the one they're thinking about there, the flathead sole fishery.
Dave, did you have a question?
Two questions. So this is a voluntary program, and your 18 boats work as a co-op, so there's no individual vessel responsibility to stay under a certain bycatch of halibut in a given time frame?
We do apportion the halibut among the different companies. So yes, there are caps on individual companies, and each company manages their boats under those caps.
And if those caps are exceeded by a particular company, can they get some more bycatch cap from some other company that's under theirs, or what happens there?
The caps can be moved within the co-op. That's the nature of the program, is the halibut caps and the target caps are all held at the cooperative level and can be moved among the different companies within the co-op. And I would say that within the co-op, I believe that it's really more the target species that we've been moving around than the halibut species, I think, significantly. And actually, yeah, I think every company has, I don't know if there's ever been a case where a company has, in our co-op, has exceeded their own starting point on halibut. I don't know of any.
Okay, thank you. One more question. You said you're aiming at a 480,000 pound increase in the area 4 CDE directed fishery for over 32-inch fish by the bycatch reductions that you're hoping to achieve here. But those bycatch reductions are for 026 fish, I think. So does there need to be, what what level of bycatch reduction will achieve a 480,000 pound increase in O32 halibut?
Mr. Commissioner, that's probably a better question for your staff than it is for me, but my understanding of the way that your catch limits work is that the bycatch at O26 and up, over 26, is what counts directly as a direct reduction from the TCEY to get you to the FCEY. So it's really, although there's a gap in your I think, harvest strategy as to what fish are to be retained, it's the O26 that you look at for purposes of defining the FCEY from the TCEY.
That's correct, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, Bruce tried to explain this to me this morning, and I didn't get it then, and I guess I'm not getting it now. But okay, so just one more quick question. I think you said that your fleet catches 48% of the halibut bycatch in the area under consideration.
Last year, that was the case.
So, what share of the burden of reducing bycatch is are the other fleets in the area going to assume?
Mr. Commissioner, this is we can't speak for the others involved in these fisheries, but some of them are here to speak to you directly.
Thank you.
I just had one question as well. It's on page 3 of your report, and we haven't had time to go through the whole document, so I probably would have other questions later. But what's the relationship between what you're proposing and the emergency order? I think it's trying to avoid the emergency order, but could you clarify that?
Mr. Commissioner, that's correct. It would be a way to avoid the uncertainty that people would walk out of this room with as to whether you need an emergency order to give this fishery more fish. So that's the objective, is to let you know what we're doing for bycatch avoidance and to reduce halibut mortality in our fisheries, in hopes that there would be no need for an emergency order in the future.
All right. I think that's the questions from the commissioners, but I'm sure that there's a number in the audience. Do we have a speaking list? And is there any on the webcast, Steve? So we're just checking on what the status of whether people have signed up for the speaking list or not. I saw it being passed around, I think. But I wanted to thank both of you before we go to questions from the audience here, both Mark and John, about your presentation and helping to provide an understanding of what you're proposing to do in order to reduce the impacts of your fleet on halibut bycatch. Oh, I see Jim has a comment.
Mr. Chairman, of course, it's mindful of the time and your prerogative to run the meeting. I believe there were other trawl groups that use bycatch prepared to address the Commission, should you want to hear them. Maybe you have the main flavor of it. I just thought I'd mention that there were, I believe, 3 more groups that could be prepared to talk to you about their efforts as well.
Well, I would take direction from some others. We have used up the half hour, but I'd be interested to hear, myself personally, be interested to hear from the others as well. And so I don't mind going over time. So what's the views of the other commissioners? So sounds like there's support for that idea. So maybe if you could just provide your name when you go up, that would be helpful, and who you represent.
I don't know.
Okay.
Oh, we have an order here. Yeah, I was getting hooked up. At the North Pacific, we just have to sit at a table and wait for the lights to go on. Good morning. My name is Stephanie Matson. I'm Executive Director of the At-Sea Processors Association. And to avoid any confusion, that also means I'm responsible for the Pollock Conservation Cooperative. The At-Sea Processors is our trade association. The Pollock Conservation Cooperative is the organization that manages our Pollock allocation and cooperative. Mr. Chairman, members of the Commission, just to be clear, it's come to my attention that we're a little confusing in the groundfish fisheries. And so to be clear, my fleet is the catcher processors that prosecute the pollock fishery offshore in the Bering Sea. So we are allocated from the government 40% of the pollock quota. There is an inshore component to that, which you'll hear from, and there's also a mothership operation that also receives allocation. So I'm just here, Mr. Chairman, today speaking about the offshore pollock processors. Mr. Chairman, a little bit about us. I've been a resident of Alaska for over 30 years. I lived in Kodiak, Cordova, spent 19 years in Unalaska, and lived the last 14 years in Juneau. Our fleet has a lot of partnerships and ownership from Western Alaskans, and so we have been aware and sensitized to the prohibited species catch as well as other bycatch. And I think that the real key here for us is the prohibited part, the indicator of what we call halibut PSC. That is prohibitive. We are not supposed to catch it, and if we do, we have to discard it. We get a little bit of flack for that, but that is the regulations. We are not allowed to keep halibut. Mr. Chairman, we are neither newcomers to this process nor new halibut users. You may not have seen us at these meetings, but because of technology, we have been participating in the webcasts for quite a few years now. I have staff that is concerned about the halibut stock assessment and particularly are paying attention. Additionally, we helped organize several years ago, as you recall, the halibut bycatch workshop because we were concerned about some of this direction. So we have been participating, maybe not directly in the room, but we are concerned. Your charts show that you have been accounting for halibut PSC for years, so we're not a new user to this arena. Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, I'm also a little concerned about the misinformation about our fleet. We carry 2 federal observers. They are federal employees. We cannot tell them not to go to the factory. They are federal employees, and it's a federal offense if you interfere with their operations. Our fleet has scales, and our fleet also has a great amount of cameras. As you probably are maybe not aware, we have been under a salmon cap for the last 4 years. And when that went into place, we had to establish and install cameras at every location where salmon could potentially be discarded. So we have 2 observers, we have scales, and we have cameras. So Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, we are very well regulated and very well watched. We have a cooperative structure that you've heard a little bit about. That cooperative structure really enables us to act quicker than the regulatory system. The North Pacific Council has really encouraged us to use our cooperative structure internal to try to address these issues. And as you become familiar with some of our issues, our salmon cap really provides incentives for our fleet inside the structure of our co-op that could not have been done on a regulatory basis. The regulations set out what has to be part of our plan, and we have to comply, addressing specifics to our fleet. In your Appendix 3, we provided you the copy that we provided to the Council back in June about what our intentions were to try to reduce halibut PSC, as well as our ongoing efforts. I encourage you to look at that. In time, I can't show you, but we looked at towing speed. We looked at the behavior of our fleet and was there differences among our vessels so that we could try to identify behavior that we wanted to change. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to identify that behavior. Like I mentioned, we looked at towing speeds, we looked at fishing locations, and we've not been able to identify behavior of any particular vessel that is worse than other vessels when it comes to halibut bycatch. So we continue to look at that. I think you would be quite surprised how much data there are in groundfish. For example, my staff can look at our vessels tow by tow, day by day, week by week, and over season. So we have the access, the ability to look at our fleet's behavior to try to identify the behaviors that may be causing halibut PSC. I should have started out that we are a small contributor to halibut PSC in the pollock fishery, but that really is temperature dependent. Our average, our 5-year average is about 172. We reduced that in 2014 about 54%. But I caution to say that that is really temperature dependent. As the cold pool comes down in the Bering Sea, as you directed users probably know, the halibut don't want to cross that cold pool. If that happens, we encounter them in our pollock fishery more than in the warm years. 2014 was a warm year, and we anticipate 2015 being the same. We continue to look at our own gear research, like you've heard about the excluders. We've been working on the green line as well, and there's another one that is kind of modeled after the Gulf halibut excluder that one of our vessels uses. We continue to fund research. At our skippers meeting, this was really a prominent feature of it. And new to that document that you have in Appendix 3, in 2015, we've started a real-time alert, similar to what we've had on salmon. So if one of our vessels in salmon exceeds a certain threshold in a tow, that alert goes out to all of the vessels, and they can click on the VMS tracks to find out exactly where that vessel was and how much salmon that vessel caught. In 2015, we were able to get that technology to work for halibut. So right now, we have set a threshold, and when one of our vessels exceeds that threshold, an alert goes out, ruins my Saturday, and you can click on the VMS tracks of that vessel to see where that vessel is to try to avoid that area. Mr. Chairman, Commissioners, that is our best hope. On-grounds communication. The fishing location information is not as clear as with our Chinook salmon. We look to see if our rolling hotspot program would be applicable for halibut. It just doesn't appear that the halibut like to go to the same spot in the Bering Sea, and I'm sure it's temperature dependent. Mr. Chairman, one last fishery. 4 of our 6 companies are involved in the yellowfin TLAS fishery. It is not a rationalized fishery, and so therefore we're not able to, we don't have a cooperative structure. But we have reached an agreement for 2015 with the other user of that TLAS fishery to reduce our halibut by 10% in that fishery, which really reflects a 59 metric ton reduction from our 2014 use. We're pleased at that because it is outside of our co-op. Again, it is not a rationalized fishery, so if other members come into that fishery, it could undermine that agreement. But Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, in summary, we are committed to working on reducing our halibut PSC. The CP pollock fleet understands that responsible management of a resource has to be done by all users and that it's critical. And I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much. Maybe I could just get an idea of how many more people are be speaking. Just 1, 2? So if I could ask you to restrict yourself to 5 minutes each. I want to make sure that there's enough time here for people in the audience to ask questions and get a better understanding. And so, and I do want to target ending by about noon. We were supposed to be concluded by now. We do have a full agenda that we're reconvening at 1 o'clock for various meetings. So if you could restrict yourself to the 5 minutes each, I would appreciate that. Then we're going to take questions from the floor.
Okay, thank you very much. I think this is working. My name is Brent Payne. I'm the director of United Catcher Boats. United Catcher Boats represents the interests of 72 trawl vessels that sorry about this. I don't quite know how this works. But, I'll just have a dangle. I think I'll just hold it. Sorry. Again, my name is Brent Payne. I am from Seattle. I work for a group called United Catcher Boats. UCB has 72 vessels that fish primarily in the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands for pollock and cod. And there are about 110 vessels that are qualified to fish pollock. There are about 35 vessels, trawl vessels, that are qualified with LLPs to fish for non-pollock in the Bering Sea Aleutian Islands. So the total universe of vessels that are catcher vessels that deliver shore-sided motherships that fish with trawl gear in the Bering Sea that encounter halibut are about 125 vessels. And those vessels range from 60 feet on the very, very small end to mostly about 125 to 150 feet in length, home ported in the communities in the Bering Sea. So what we I'm going to talk about our Pacific cod fishery. Last year, over the last couple of years, there's been about 35 to 40 vessels that have targeted cod, primarily out of Dutch Harbor and Akutan, and also out in the Aleutians. Those vessels, most of them are involved in the American Fisheries Act cooperative structure, but some of them are not. And within the, I would start my presentation by saying, if you're asking for voluntary measures to occur by a fleet of vessels, it's a lot easier to do voluntary measures when you have cooperative structures or rationalized fisheries. For vessels that are still racing for fish or not involved in a cooperative structure, it's very difficult to get them to agree to provisions that you voluntarily establish through contract because they're not involved in an organizational structure. So we have a little bit of that in the Bering Sea cod fishery. It's not a rationalized fishery. There are still vessels out there that are trying to catch more fish than they possibly have caught in the past. Under a rationalized fishery, what we do with our cooperative structure is we take the certain amount of cod that are allocated to those vessels, we allocate that out to the individual cooperatives, and there's 8 co-ops, and then those co-ops allocate that out or portion it out to their individual members. So and then they sign an agreement, and they agree that they're going to behave in a certain way if they're going to get that fish. Within the American Fisheries Act catcher vessel cooperative structure, we also allocate halibut out to those vessels. But that is, so those 110 vessels that are possible that could fish under the American Fisheries Act, about 35 of them are fishing for cod. They agree to a certain number of provisions. And what we've done, starting in 2000, we looked at ways of organizing the cod fishery so that the bycatch of halibut doesn't get used up in an irrational manner. So we have a couple of provisions that we do. One is we require that they do no night fishing, because we talked about that before, and Commissioner Lang, you talked about that. We actually send out a chart of the sunset and sunrise to the vessels, and they cannot fish at night. Secondly, we require 100% use of excluders. I talked to a number of captains coming up to this season, and there's, I think, a heightened sense of excitement about the use of a halibut excluder. We've done a lot of work with salmon excluders. We've done less work with halibut excluders, but like John Godwin presented to you earlier, we require 100% use of excluders when we're fishing for cod in order to exclude halibut, and the rates are amazing. It's quite an effective tool. The last thing we require is an 8-inch size cod end mesh size in order to have the smaller halibut get filtered out in the cod end. So those are requirements that we voluntarily are implementing. That they're not federal regulations, and but we enforce those through our cooperative agreement. The other thing we do, and there was some talk about observer coverage yesterday, is under the new federal observer program, you enter a random pool, and you don't know whether you're going to have an observer or not, but you do that on a trip-by-trip basis. In order to implement our provisions in our cooperative, we need really good data at the individual vessel level. We can't use a fleet-wide average in order to determine how much halibut an individual vessel is experiencing, because we allocate halibut out to the individual vessel through the cooperative structure. So we need to have a higher percentage of observer coverage in our cod fishery. We have 100% observer coverage in our pollock fishery. So the fleet has voluntarily agreed to carry observers 100% of the time when they're fishing cod. And this year there's 28 vessels that have signed up. So they're paying for an observer on a day-by-day basis. That's a little over $300. Plus they're also paying the observer fee, the odds fee that the government assesses. And that's to get better observer data from our vessels. And we find that to be very important. I think I'm probably over time, Paul. So the improvement's amazing. I mean, last year we caught, roughly about 90 million pounds of cod, and we used about 270 metric tons of halibut. In the pollock fishery, we caught 1.5 billion pounds of halibut, and we used about 52 metric tons of halibut. I'm sorry. We got, the catch vessel sector caught about 660,000 metric tons of pollock, and to do that, the mortality of halibut assigned was roughly about 52 metric tons. And like Stephanie said, we've worked to improve that. So Those are the numbers. So thank you very much for the opportunity. The catcher vessels are very understanding of the situation here. They asked me to be here to listen to your concerns, and we'll be talking about this issue, I'm sure, at the North Pacific Council meeting over the next 6 or 7 months. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Brent. One more, and if you could restrict yourself to 5 minutes, please.
Okay, I think this works now. Thanks. I will try to be brief and stay within the time frame as best as I can. I wanted to talk today because I just wanted to provide some full perspective on where we fit into the groundfish fisheries, and to make sure you're aware of our participation there as well. My name's Chad C. with the Freezer Longline Coalition. We are hook and line catcher processor vessels that operate in the Bering Sea and the Aleutian Islands. There's about 30 of us that are 30 vessels actively participating in the fishery. We target Pacific cod almost exclusively. All of our members are also members of the Freezer Longline Conservation Cooperative, which is a voluntary cooperative established to sustainably manage the quota allocated to our sector by the North Pacific Fishery Management Council. We work collaboratively with National Marine Fisheries Service to ensure an efficient and responsible harvest of the Pacific cod quota, and to maximize optimum yield and to minimize bycatch, including for halibut. The FLC and our members take seriously the responsibility to be stewards of the environment and to manage the resources that inhabit the waters we fish. Our members are Alaskans and Washingtonians who spend their careers living and working in the communities in western Alaska and participating in the Pacific cod fishery. And in addition to the Pacific cod fishery, many of us also participate in other fisheries, including the directed halibut fishery. So these concerns that are before us on the halibut resource have a real and direct impact on our members, and we share an interest in sustaining these resources for us for now and in the future. Our coalition has had a long history of voluntary actions on minimizing halibut PSC. This includes provisions within our co-op to manage the PSC catch, including severe penalties for exceeding limits on the PSC catch established by our cooperative. We proactively take our own efforts to address the mortality in our fleet. Some of the ways that we address halibut mortality and trying to minimize it are one is primarily its communication, working on making sure that everyone is aware of the catch and the mortality, where and what we might do to reduce that. We have weekly reports on halibut PSC by vessels. We analyze catch data by sea state, one of the data collection services. We have annual crew meetings and have recently in 2014 established the FLC Halibut Bycatch Committee to address all of these issues that are before us on this issue. Additionally, and some of us have talked about this as well, is the 100% observer coverage. For our vessels, every vessel has one, sometimes two vessels, two observers on our vessels at all times, national federal observers. We also have the flow scales on each of all but one of our vessels, and we have cameras on that are installed throughout the vessel. This includes at the rail and includes in the factory. So there's constant observation in terms of our catch and our harvest practices. We also, as a longliners, we practice careful release practices that we train our staff, our crew on, to ensure that we are carefully releasing halibut that are caught on our lines. The result of this has been a consistent and sustained reduction of halibut mortality by our fleet. Just in the past year, following the June Council meeting, North Pacific Council meeting, where they called upon the sectors to take further reductions, we, for 2014, from our 2009 to 2013 average, we reduced our halibut mortality by over 23% and our mortality rate by 33.2%. And that's just using the assumed discard mortality rate for 2014. If you were to take the actual discard mortality rate, the observed discard mortality rate, we would those numbers are even higher. So, in overall, since 2020, in the last 10 years, or even the last 20 years, we've from 1994 to 2014, we've reduced our numbers from by over 58%, and actual DMR by 47%, and our encounter rate by 41%. So we're committed to maintaining these practices that we are working on, that we've enacted to make these reductions, and fully expect that these reductions will continue with these practices that we have in place, and we'll continue to be communicating and working hard on making these reductions happen. So with that, I'll conclude my comments.
Thank you very much, Chad. And thanks to Brent and Stephanie and John and Mark again for coming and providing that information to the Commission. I guess what it does really highlight to me as one of the commissioners here is about that we do need to coordinate how we are making actions around bycatch and having a better appreciation of the fleets that are impacting upon halibut, which is the intent of the meeting with the Council that we have on February the 5th, to get a better appreciation of what we can and can't do and what will work. And so that's really what it highlights, and I do appreciate you making the time to provide the information today about the efforts that you are making and how you see moving ahead. I'm going to open the floor. It's about 11:45, and I was still targeting around noon to complete, but we'll see how many people have questions or comments that they want to make on what they've heard. All right, thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Is that on? Is it on now?
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Duncan Fields. I'm speaking today representing...
You'll have to, excuse me, you'll have to get closer, and if you could provide your name as well.
My name is Duncan Fields, and I'm speaking today on behalf of Cape Barnabas, Inc. and Uzinki Community Holding Company, which are the community halibut holding entities for the native villages of Uzinki and Old Harbor on Kodiak Island. And the question I have is specifically for the Amendment 80 H&G fleet. I know that they had talked about approximately 50% of the bycatch in the Bering Sea, and they represented what one of the co-ops is doing substantial efforts in savings. But it's my understanding that there's more than one co-op in that sector, and my question is there any information relative to what the other co-op may be doing for halibut bycatch savings in the next year?
Mr. Commissioner, in response to the question, we have spoken with the other cooperative about what they're up to, but at this point we don't have a clear picture of what exactly they're doing. So I don't, I can't speak on behalf of them. We know that they are aware of the problem and concerned, but I can't say as to what they're doing. They're not part of our association, and we do communicate with them. And we've made them aware of what we're up to as best we can. We weren't exactly sure where we would be coming into this meeting because of just discussions among our members, but we tried to keep them up on kind of what we were thinking and how our train of thought is going.
Jerry?
Thank you. My name is Jerry Christensen from Canada's Sport Fishing Advisory Board. And I guess my question or comment is really directed to the first presentation, the Alaska Seafood Cooperatives, and who suggested a number of measures which are impressive, and I commend them for that. But as I heard the presentation, it would seem to me that they were talking about taking these new other special actions with respect to areas 4C, D, and E. And so I guess my question to them is, from the perspective of those of us who are concerned about the overall health of the resource, is the promise that you seem to be making for the coming year related only to that area, or is this an announcement of a new general approach to try and reduce halibut impacts throughout the fishery with which you're involved?
Mr. Commissioner, in response to the question, it's a general approach. I mean, we recognize that it doesn't solve any problem to just shift our effort to other areas. I mean, there's a limited extent to which we could do that anyway, because the target fisheries are general that we're speaking of are generally that have, you know, that you're looking at as being problematic and that have caused this kind of uptick are generally located exclusively in 4C, D, and E. There are some spillovers into other areas, but largely they're 4C, D, E fisheries. And we have talked internally about the need to make sure that we're not just displacing bycatch into another area to affect those users. And we've talked about what the numbers look like in those other areas, and we'll be tracking that as well.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Sean McManus, Deep Sea Fishermen's Union. I have one question directed at Mr. Trevina's group, and that the 10% that he mentioned, and this might allude to the earlier speaker, but he mentioned a 10% reduction, voluntary reduction. I'm wondering if that's across the board. And the reason I ask that is because if you look on page 164 of the Blue Book, there's a 63% increase between the 2014 fishery CUI and the 2015 Blue Line. And meanwhile, there's a 37% reduction in Area 4D and a 70% reduction in 4C, D, and E. That's my first question to you.
What we were asked to do by the council was a 10% reduction from June on in the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands. And that was directed, I think, to all user groups. I can only speak to what our sector did. And we looked at our 5-year historic average from July to December, and that's what we measured off. So our reduction for the last 6 months of the year met that target. And it was directed at Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands generally. We're managed by the National Marine Fisheries Service on a BSAI-wide limit. So it doesn't have the focus that your management areas has with separation of 4CDE from 4A and 4B. And that along with the over 26 direct effect on your catch limits, I think led to the mismatch between our action and the outcome in the Blue Line projection.
Okay, thank you. My second final question is more towards the pelagic trawl group, and that is, if we're to believe a senior scientist with Monterey Bay Aquarium Seafood Watch, they claim that the pelagic trawl gear is on the bottom 44% of the time, and given the vast volume of fish that's caught using pelagic trawl gear, that 44% of the time that the trawl gear is on the bottom accounts for all of the hard-on-bottom trawl fishing combined. And with that said, if we're to believe that, and there's been discussion about avoiding Chinook salmon bycatch, and also the possible increase in the stock for pollock, it seems like a recipe for disaster if you're a halibut fisherman, and the fact that they're avoiding Chinook salmon and there's a pollock stock increase. So despite the efforts to use halibut excluders and deck sorting, it would seem to me that halibut, trawl halibut bycatch would increase. Thank you.
My name is Chris Sporer. I'm with the Pacific Halibut Management Association, British Columbia, Canada. I have a lot of questions, but I'll try and limit them here. I think the first point, first of all, thank you for coming and presenting that information. A lot of it was very helpful, a lot of stuff we didn't know. I just want to touch on a couple points made by the Canadian commissioners. One is we've got information in the RAW that sort of talks about bycatch by fishery or by gear type. I wonder if there's a way to even break it down more in terms of what fleets are impacting the bycatch. It's just, we've heard about the reductions in bycatch here, yet we all saw that slide that showed the directed catch has gone down by more than 50%, but the bycatch has only gone down by 10%. So you know, what's going on? Where is this bycatch actually occurring? So I'm wondering, you know, how far we can drill it down here would be very helpful. And then the other thing is, the other question I had is on the question of the excluder devices that are used. What's the mortality rate on those, and how is that determined? And is there like a peer-reviewed science literature on that we could see?
Yeah. So I'm going to address the second question. We have looked into how we might obtain data from escapement of halibut, working with Dr. Greg Rose at the Alaska Fisheries Science Center, because obviously that's an important question. And the consensus among the scientists we talked to through Dr. Rose's efforts is the efforts to recapture the fish that escape would probably have more of an effect on the halibut than what appears to be their condition when they're escaping. So the reason they know that is we really do have good underwater camera systems now, and we have had systems for a long time, but the ones we have now can be used on a toe-by-toe basis and really give you a lot of data about what the fish look like. And as Dr. Rose and others have looked at that, they're pretty convinced, and this is not peer-reviewed information, but this is from someone who works with what he calls conservation engineering as a NOAA scientist, that really the halibut are pretty hardy, and that certainly they look like they're not being hurt in the process of escapement. Certainly, it's better than bringing them on deck. So that's why I called it the first line of defense, is to get them out with an excluder if you can. I'd be happy to share some video of that, and you could make your own assessment. But the problem is going to be to do peer-reviewed science on that. You have to recapture that fish, bring it to the surface, and look at it. I don't know of any way to sample, the things you might look at to look at its physiology without actually affecting it more than the excluder probably affects it. So hopefully that answers your question. But again, if you'd like to see video, I'd be happy to sit down and show you and use your own.
No, I mean, that's okay. Like I said, I'm probably not qualified to look at a video and determine whether the fish survived or not. But I appreciate that information. The final question I had is, we heard today sort of, some facts on how much the level of observer coverage. There are, in fact, cameras on some boats. So another sort of rumor, innuendo, we hear about the use of, or we have heard about the use of crucifiers on some of the bigger boats. And I'm Catholic, so crucifiers get my attention right away. So are these used? Aren't they used? Can anybody provide some information on that?
Mr. Commissioner, if I could answer your first question, and let probably Chad C. answer the third question. I think that in the Bering Sea Aleutian Islands fishery, we're really blessed with an amazing amount of data that's collected that the agency and the council staff can use to look at this issue. We have 100% observer coverage on most of the vessels that are fishing in the Bering Sea fisheries. We have VMS requirements, and then we also have our own. So for space and time, we know with very, very high precision and accuracy what the amount of halibut is removed and where, and the rates relative to various fisheries. The North Pacific Council has established a whole matrix of allocations of halibut down into the different sectors. And there's staff here and council members here, council staff here, and the agency staff that can provide that. So in the Bering Sea, at least, we have extremely good information to use to analyze. So I hope that answers your question. So we know where the halibut bycatch occurs, and when, and where, in what fisheries.
No, I'm not disputing that. What I'm trying to figure out is how do we get it in one nice table format. That's what I'd like to see. Maybe it's out there somewhere and I haven't stumbled across it.
Probably not, Chris, but I think it goes back to my comments earlier about what we're trying to accomplish with some of the meetings we have set up. The reason I was stressing about or maybe I wasn't stressing enough about the 12 o'clock timeline. There are impacts. It takes an hour and a half to set up the room in here, so we're going to have to delay the start of the conference board that will be in here now at 1:30. And so there are 2 more speakers in line, and then there's also one on the webcast. And I think there's going to be, I know there'll be much more time to have further discussions around this issue, and we can figure out how to structure that. So Gary, if you could...
My name is Gary Williamson. I'm a member of the Canadian Caucus, and I put a proposal to our caucus that we draw a line in the sand here and no more apportionment. My feeling is we don't want to apportion any more fish to Alaska to be dragged up in a dragger. So our guys do without fishing so that they can grind them up. This has been going on for too bloody long. And it's high time you guys got off your butt and did something. You've talked about doing it for years. And what's happened? Take a look in the rearview mirror. Nothing. And I'm afraid that we're headed down the same road. So anyway, that was my submission to our caucus. They maybe didn't like it, but that was it. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary.
Mr. Chairman, understanding that there were changes in the schedule to accommodate the other user groups of halibut, this on the agenda was our opportunity to have public comment on our catch limit proposals. Would it be okay if I did that at this time and then touch a little bit on bycatch after?
They do take time to set up the rooms, and so we're going to be delaying things. And I just wonder, maybe on your proposal, that we could schedule that for a different time that we could put, and then if you could ask your questions here for this group, and then we'll definitely make time for you. I'm not trying to not provide the time to address the first part.
Okay, yes, sir. So if I understood that correctly, then you would like me to address the bycatch?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. So, Commissioners, as you know, the North Pacific Fisheries Management Council is going to take up halibut bycatch reduction measures next week, and the current range of options on the table are to reduce the bycatch cap in the Bering Sea from 0 to 35%. And all of us know that that really doesn't solve the problem long term, and a 35% reduction to the bycatch cap really is about a 10% reduction in use from current levels. And so what we'd like to see done at this meeting going into next week, and what I think that the Halibut Commission could potentially do to help the Council through that process would be to really endorse and encourage the idea of abundance-based halibut PSC, where we get back to some equitable split of the resource. And so if we can manage this thing on abundance-based and have some sector split between the directed users and the bycatch users of the resource, then we can all share in the highs and the lows. And the way that it's currently gone is bycatch has been increasing in the Bering Sea since 2011. It has increased year over year since 2011, and during that time we've, since as the directed halibut fishermen, received 65% reductions. And if we go to the blue line this year, that would represent an 85% reduction. So for purposes of conservation and sustainability, it's really been on the backs of the directed halibut fishermen who have taken significant cuts while others have remained relatively constant. The PSC cap for the Amendment 80 fleet, for instance, is about 3.8 million pounds, of which since the implementation of Amendment 80 they've used on average 86% of that allocation. That allocation has remained constant. We have taken substantial cuts to the tune of 65%, and looking at a blue line of 520,000 pounds, which would represent about an 85 or 86% cut in that 4-year period since 2011. We think that the ultimate solution to this is that we slice this pie up in a way that is equitable and fair and gets back to historical use levels, and allows us all to share in conservation and sustainability, all to share in the lows, and at the same time to all share in the highs when the abundance increases. And then the last thing I want to touch on about halibut bycatch that kind of came to my attention, and it was something that Glenn Merrill recently put out, and it was a collection of bycatch mortality data from the Halibut Commission, and then kind of audited with NIMS to look at the numbers. And the numbers that the Halibut Commission had been using for halibut bycatch mortality were very, very close to the numbers that NIMS has put out for halibut bycatch mortality. One thing that jumped out at me in looking at those numbers is that a very high percentage of the halibut bycatch mortality in Area 4 CD&E is coming out of the closed area. I have those numbers here. And so in 2011, 48% of the halibut bycatch from Area 4 CD&E came out of the closed area. In 2012, 45% of mortality happened in the closed area. In 2013, 54% of the bycatch mortality attributed to 4 CD&E came out of the closed area, and then in 2014, 42% of mortality from 4 CD&E was actually caught in the closed area where we're not allowed to fish. So I don't know, I don't really have any agenda with that. It's just an interesting piece of information that I think that we should all know about. And the other question is, how much does that closed area attribute to the exploitable biomass in 4 CD&E? Because there's I think maybe 3 survey stations, NIMS trawl survey stations, hit the corner of that closed area, but I don't even know if it's surveyed what the abundance might be. And then again, the fish that are in there, are they attributed to the exploitable biomass for 4 CD&E, since the removals from that closed area come directly from our allocation? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Steve, there's one person still on had a question on the web.
Yes, Mr. Chair. There's actually 2 questions from John Youngblood, and the first question may have already been addressed. I'll read it. The use of excluder panels for reduced mortality assumes the fish released have 0% mortality. Trawls don't outrun fish but corral fish until they're too tired to keep up and fall back into the net. The fish at that point are under various conditions of stress. Has there been any mortality assessments with this method of release? It is certainly better than having the fish go into the cod end, but to assume 100% survival rate could be detrimental to the halibut stock if no mortality estimates are done on the fish that are released. Have any mortality assessments been done anyway in reference to excluder panels? So that's the first question. I don't know if one of you guys wants to answer that. Pretty much already addressed that. The second question is about cod fishing. Also from John Youngblood, before the cooperative was formed, open access fisheries didn't fish cod in the spring and summer when halibut moved into the shallows. This was needed to avoid a fishery shutdown due to bycatch. Do you continue this conservation practice since the cooperative has formed? Cod boats that fish the edge many times are open to predation by killer whales, which will strip halibut off the line while leaving cod on the line. What effort have you done to prevent that?
Presumably you're talking about the Freezer Longline Coalition, Freezer Longline Conservation Cooperative and our hook and line vessels. We fish year-round. That's part of efforts to disperse the catch across the entire year. There's many benefits for that conservation-wise. And so we're all aware of the halibut bycatch numbers in certain times of the year, and that's something that we communicate about on a regular basis. Part of what I was referring to in terms of monitoring the catch and our PSC numbers on a twice-weekly basis. So we're very constantly aware of the numbers and what we need, and we make sure that our vessels and our crew are aware about that, so we can take actions as necessary to reduce those numbers if needed.
Is that it then, Steve? Yeah. So, Lou, looks like you really have something burning that you need to say. Is that right?
My name is Lou Dockman. I'm from Kodiak. I'm a halibut fisherman. This will be my 41st year of fishing halibut. So I'm a third of that time that we have had halibut fishing, 120 years plus. My main concern is bycatch. And I've been to many, many meetings, and we've sent letters to the to Congress, we've sent them to NOAA, we've sent them to everyone that is responsible for this bycatch, and nothing has been done. We got a new observer program that is a farce. In the past, we've had 30% observer coverage in the Gulf. Now we're down to 13% for the draggers. But my main concern is for Area 4. The bycatch there has been up to 20 million pounds. We're down to 3.3 million pounds in catches. Last year it was over 10 million pounds. And we're down to 3.3 million pounds, and we're being forced out of business. This is not a smart move when draggers go out and scrape 20 million square miles of bottom and leave nothing for the big spearmen. I'm a halibut fisherman, I'm a crab fisherman, and I fish all those areas. And it's crazy that the commission stands by and does nothing because it has no power. You're like a lion that has been to a dentist and everything has been fixed and you have no fight. And it's ridiculous that this continues forever. So I suggest that this commission get together with both states and put some teeth in this organization. Because just saying it's going to change is not going to help. 8 years we've sent letters to Congress and nothing has happened. N-O-T-H-I-N-G, nothing. And it's time they change. And I want to have some answers why 15 million pounds of fish get caught in the Bering Sea and we get 3.3 million pounds. Please answer. You guys are all here. I'm glad the draggers are here. So tell me, how does it happen? I get nothing out of it. Always the same thing. Something has to change, and it has to happen now. And the commission has no bite, and it needs teeth. And I appreciate your help. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lynn. With that, we're going to adjourn this session. The conference board will be meeting in this room starting at roughly 1:30. It takes them that much time to set up the room. The administrative session as well will start at 1:30. As for the Canadian delegation, we'll be meeting in this room at 5:30. We'll target for 5:30 and see how that goes. But it'll be in this room, not the Shaughnessy.